Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles. Wherever you happen to be listening from right now, whether you're winding down after a long day or letting this play quietly in the background while your thoughts slow down, I'm glad you're here. This channel exists for a very simple reason. It's a place where everyday human struggles are examined through biology, psychology, and lived experience, without pressure, without hype, and without pretending that change is easy just because someone says it should be. Tonight we're going to spend some time with a question that almost everyone has asked themselves at some point, usually late at night, usually after another promise quietly fell apart. Why is it so hard to stay consistent? Why do we begin things with confidence and intention, only to drift away from them days or weeks later, even when we know they matter? Before we go any further, take a moment to notice where you are. What room are you in right now? Is it quiet, or is there a low hum of sound around you? And if you happen to glance at the clock, what time is it where you are? That small detail matters more than it seems, because the experience of discipline, or the lack of it, always unfolds inside real moments like this one. Not in motivational speeches, not in ideal schedules, but in ordinary evenings and mornings where energy is uneven and attention comes and goes. If you find this kind of slow, grounded exploration helpful, or if it gives you a sense of calm rather than pressure, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this space reach people who might need a quieter explanation, instead of another push to try harder. Most conversations about discipline start in the wrong place. They usually begin with effort, with willpower, with grit. Someone tells you that consistency is a choice, that successful people simply decide to show up every day, and that if you're not doing that, something must be missing inside you. But that framing skips over the most important part of the story. It assumes that inconsistency is a failure of character, rather than a predictable outcome of how human systems actually work. When people say, "I just can't stay consistent," what they're often describing isn't laziness or lack of desire. It's a mismatch between expectations and biology. Think about how often discipline is treated like a moral trait. You either have it or you don't. Some people are labelled disciplined, others are not, and the explanation usually ends there. But when you look closely at real life, that explanation starts to fall apart. The same person who struggles to exercise regularly might be extremely consistent at showing up for work. Someone who can't maintain a daily routine might reliably care for others without missing a beat. Consistency clearly exists in pieces, not as a single trait that applies to everything equally. That alone should raise questions about whether discipline is really about personal strength, or whether it's about context, structure, and how the brain responds to demands over time. Another common assumption is that inconsistency means you don't want something badly enough. But desire is not the same thing as sustained action. Wanting change is easy. Repeating behaviour when the initial excitement has worn off is something else entirely. The gap between those two states is where most discipline problems live. And that gap isn't empty. It's filled with fatigue, distraction, emotional shifts, stress, and competing priorities that rarely get acknowledged in simple advice. What makes this especially confusing is that inconsistency often shows up even when the goal is genuinely important. People don't fail to stay consistent only with trivial things. They struggle with habits that affect their health, their finances, their sense of self-respect. That disconnect creates frustration. If this matters so much, why does it keep slipping? The usual response is to blame oneself and promise to do better next time, without ever changing the conditions that caused the problem in the first place. There's also a quiet pattern that repeats itself. At the beginning of any new effort, discipline feels almost effortless. The first few days are energized, the idea feels fresh, progress feels visible. Then, without a clear moment where things go wrong, resistance starts to appear. Skipped days become easier to justify, small disruptions turn into breaks, and eventually the habit fades out, often accompanied by guilt or resignation. What's rarely noticed is that this pattern is remarkably consistent across people and goals. That alone suggests that something structural is happening, not just something personal. To understand why staying consistent is so difficult, we need to stop asking why people fail and start asking what the brain is optimized to do. The human nervous system did not evolve to support long-term abstract goals with delayed rewards. It evolved to manage energy, respond to immediate demands, and keep the organism alive under changing conditions. From that perspective, inconsistency isn't a flaw, it's a default setting. Conserving effort, avoiding unnecessary strain, and shifting attention based on what feels most urgent are features, not bugs. This becomes clearer when you notice how consistency often collapses during periods of stress or change. When life becomes unpredictable, routines fall apart first. Not because people stop caring, but because the brain reallocates resources. Mental energy is finite. When it's pulled towards survival-related concerns, long-term plans lose priority. The problem is that modern life creates constant low-level stress without clear resolution, leaving people in a state where they're always managing something but never fully recovering. In that environment, expecting perfect consistency is unrealistic. Another overlooked factor is emotional regulation. Discipline is often framed as the ability to act regardless of how you feel. But feelings don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. They influence attention, motivation, and perception, whether we acknowledge them or not. When people are tired, discouraged, or overwhelmed, the effort required to stay consistent increases. Without systems that account for those fluctuations, inconsistency becomes inevitable. There's also the issue of time perception. At the start of a habit, the future reward feels close enough to matter. Over time, that reward drifts further away in the mind, even if the actual timeline hasn't changed. The brain discounts distant outcomes. This isn't a lack of intelligence, it's how decision-making systems are wired. Immediate relief almost always feels more valuable than long-term benefit, especially when energy is low. All of this creates a situation where people keep applying the same solution to a problem that isn't being correctly identified. They try to motivate themselves more. They set stricter rules. They promise accountability. Sometimes that works briefly, but it rarely lasts. The underlying structure remains unchanged, so the cycle repeats. Each repetition adds another layer of self-doubt, making the next attempt heavier than the last. What we're going to do over the course of this series is slow this entire process down and examine it carefully. Not to assign blame, and not to offer quick fixes, but to understand why consistency breaks down so reliably and what actually helps it survive. That means looking at how motivation behaves over time, how habits interact with identity, how environments quietly shape behavior, and why burnout is often mistaken for a lack of discipline. It also means questioning some very common advice that sounds reasonable, but ignores how humans actually function. None of this requires becoming a different kind of person. It requires understanding the kind of organism you already are. When discipline is treated as biological skill rather than a personal virtue, the conversation changes. The question shifts from "why can't I stay consistent?" to "what conditions make consistency easier or harder for a system like mine?" That shift alone removes a surprising amount of pressure. As we continue, you'll start to notice that discipline isn't something you force into existence. It's something that emerges when friction is reduced, expectations are realistic, and effort is aligned with how attention and energy actually work. That doesn't mean consistency becomes effortless, but it does mean it stops feeling like a constant internal battle. For now, it's enough to recognize that inconsistency is not a personal defect, it's a signal. And like most signals the body and mind produce, it's trying to communicate something specific. Understanding that message is the first step, and from here, we can begin to look more closely at the beliefs that keep people stuck in this cycle. Starting with one of the most persistent ideas of all, that motivation is supposed to carry you through when discipline runs out. Most attempts at consistency begin with a promise, not the kind made out loud to other people, but the quiet kind made internally, often at the end of a day when something didn't go the way it was supposed to. It usually sounds reasonable. Tomorrow I'll start. This week I'll be different. From now on I'll stick to it. These promises aren't dramatic and they're rarely dishonest. In the moment they're made, they feel sincere, even necessary. They create a sense of order after disappointment, a way to close the gap between how things are and how they should be. But what's interesting isn't that we make these promises, it's how often we make the same ones in almost identical language after almost identical outcomes. If you pay attention, you'll notice that the promise itself becomes part of the cycle. Something doesn't get done. A routine slips. A habit fades. Then comes the internal conversation that resets everything. You reassure yourself that the intention is still there, that next time will be different, that you understand what went wrong. The promise offers relief. It restores a sense of control, even before any behavior changes. In that sense, the promise already does some of the emotional work that consistency is supposed to do. It makes you feel better now, which reduces the urgency to change the conditions that led to the problem. This is one reason promises feel powerful but don't reliably lead to action. They operate in the emotional present, not the behavioral future. When you promise yourself something, you're responding to discomfort, not building a system. The brain registers that discomfort has been addressed, at least partially, and that reduces the pressure to follow through immediately. There's no deception involved. It's simply how emotional regulation works. Relief comes first. Action is postponed. There's also a timing issue. These promises are often made when motivation is artificially high. That spike usually comes from contrast. You compare where you are with where you think you should be, and the difference creates emotional energy. But that energy isn't stable. It fades as soon as the comparison loses intensity, which usually happens quickly. When the next day arrives, the conditions that supported the promise no longer exist. Fatigue returns, distractions reappear. The emotional charge that made consistency feel obvious is gone. Another detail that's easy to miss is how vague these promises usually are. They rely on general intentions rather than specific behaviours. Be more disciplined, stay consistent, try harder. None of these phrases describe an action that can actually be performed. They describe an outcome or a trait. When the brain is asked to act on vague instructions, it defaults to familiar patterns. And familiar patterns are often the ones that cause the problem in the first place. Promises also tend to assume that the future version of you will be more capable than the present one. There's an implicit belief that tomorrow you will have more energy, more clarity, more self-control. This belief is comforting, but is rarely accurate. Most days resemble each other more than we expect. The constraints that exist now are usually still there later. When the future self fails to live up to the promise, the disappointment feels personal, even though the prediction was flawed from the start. What makes this especially difficult is that the act of promising feels like responsibility. You're acknowledging the problem. You're taking ownership. That's often praised as maturity. But responsibility without adjustment doesn't produce change. It produces repetition. Each new promise reinforces the idea that the solution lies in commitment rather than design. Over time, this can lead to a subtle erosion of trust in yourself, not because you're incapable, but because the promises were never matched to reality. There's also a social layer to this, even when the promise is private. We grow up hearing that self-discipline is about keeping your word. If you don't follow through, it's framed as a failure of integrity. That framing can turn inconsistency into a character issue rather than a practical one. Once that happens, people stop experimenting with structure and start focusing on self-judgment. The promise becomes a test of worth instead of a tool for change. Another pattern worth noticing is how these promises often reset expectations unrealistically high. After a period of inconsistency, people don't promise to do slightly better. They promise to do it perfectly, every day, no exceptions. That creates a fragile plan. The first disruption, which is inevitable, feels like total failure. When the standard is absolute, partial success doesn't register. One missed day becomes proof that the promise was broken, even if progress was made elsewhere. This all happens quietly, without conscious planning. The mind reaches for what feels like a solution, and the promise is familiar, simple, and emotionally satisfying. It doesn't require analysis or change. It only requires intention. Unfortunately, intention alone doesn't account for how behavior is shaped by context, energy levels, emotional states, and environmental cues. Without addressing those factors, promises operate in isolation. It's also important to recognize that making promises isn't useless. It serves a function. It signals that something matters. It marks a moment of awareness. The problem isn't the promise itself, but the expectation that the promise will do the work that systems and structures are meant to do. When that expectation goes unmet, people often double down on the same strategy, promising harder instead of redesigning the situation. If you look closely, you'll see that people rarely make promises about things that are already supported by their environment. Nobody promises themselves to brush their teeth consistently. Nobody makes a vow to check their phone. Those behaviors are already embedded. They don't rely on motivation or self-talk. They rely on cues, routines, and low friction. The fact that discipline-related promises cluster around certain behaviors tells you something about where the real difficulty lies. Another subtle issue is that promises focus attention on outcomes rather than processes. Stay consistent sounds like a destination, not a method. When progress slows or becomes invisible, the promise feels unfulfilled even if the process is ongoing. This creates impatience. People start evaluating success based on how they feel rather than what they've actually done. When the feeling isn't there, the behavior stops. Over time, repeated promises can create a kind of background noise. They lose impact. The words still form, but they don't carry the same weight. At that point, people often conclude that something is wrong with their motivation or personality. In reality, the brain has simply learned that promises are not predictive of outcomes. They've become signals without consequences. This is where many people get stuck. They oscillate between disappointment and recommitment, never pausing long enough to question the structure of the cycle itself. The focus stays on effort, not design, on intention, not conditions. And because promises are internal, the cycle remains invisible to others, reinforcing the idea that the struggle is personal and private. What's missing from these promises is an honest assessment of constraints. How tired are you actually? How much attention do you really have at the end of the day? What competes with this habit right now? Promises rarely include these questions because they complicate the narrative. They introduce limits, but limits are where realistic consistency begins. Another thing promises tend to ignore is recovery. Consistency isn't just about showing up, it's about returning after disruption. Most promises don't account for that. They assume a straight line. When the line breaks, the plan collapses. Without a built-in way to resume, stopping feels permanent even when it doesn't have to be. It's also worth noticing how promises often isolate the individual from their environment. They frame consistency as something that happens inside your head, but behavior is heavily influenced by what's around you. Cues, defaults, interruptions, and access all matter. Ignoring those factors makes the promise heavier than it needs to be. The result of all this is a strange situation where people are deeply committed to change, but repeatedly disappointed by their own methods. They care enough to promise themselves improvement, but not in a way that matches how change actually unfolds. Over time, that gap becomes discouraging. What begins to help is not abandoning promises, but reframing what they're for. A promise doesn't need to be a declaration of future perfection. It can be a signal to examine why something keeps breaking down. Instead of saying, "I'll be consistent from now on," the more useful question is, what keeps getting in the way when I try? That question shifts attention from willpower to observation. As we move forward, it becomes clear that the issue isn't a lack of commitment, it's an over-reliance on commitment as a solution. Discipline doesn't fail because people don't care enough. It fails because caring isn't the same as being supported. Once that distinction is made, the role of motivation, effort and self-talk starts to look very different, and the conversation naturally turns toward one of the most misunderstood forces in this whole process, the belief that motivation is supposed to carry consistency when everything else stays the same. Motivation is usually treated as the engine of discipline. When people talk about staying consistent, they almost always talk about feeling motivated, finding motivation, or losing motivation. It's described as the thing that gets you started and the thing that keeps you going. When consistency breaks down, the explanation is simple and familiar. Motivation ran out. That explanation feels intuitive, but it hides a deeper problem. Motivation doesn't fail because it's weak. It fails because it was never designed to do the job we keep assigning to it. Motivation is a state, not a system. It's temporary, reactive, and highly sensitive to context. It rises in response to novelty, emotion, and perceived opportunity, and it falls just as easily when those conditions change. Expecting it to behave like a stable resource is like expecting adrenaline to keep you alive indefinitely. It's useful in short bursts, not as a long-term support structure. At the beginning of a new habit or goal, motivation often feels abundant. There's a sense of clarity. The benefits are obvious. The costs feel manageable. This is not accidental. The brain is responding to novelty and anticipation. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter involved in motivation and reward prediction, spikes when something new promises improvement. This creates energy, focus, and a feeling of drive. In that early phase, consistency feels easy. Not because you've become more disciplined, but because the environment inside your brain is temporarily favourable. The problem starts when novelty fades. Dopamine is not a reward chemical in the simple sense. It's a signal that tells the brain something is worth pursuing. Once a behaviour becomes familiar, that signal weakens. The brain says, "I know this now." The behaviour may still be good for you, but it's no longer exciting. Motivation drops, not because you're failing, but because the brain has moved on to scanning for the next potential opportunity. This is where many people get confused. They assume motivation should stay constant if the goal is important enough. But importance and motivation are not the same thing. You can care deeply about something and still feel no motivation to act on it in a given moment. The brain doesn't rank priorities based on values alone. It ranks them based on immediacy, emotional salience, and perceived effort. Another issue is that motivation is highly state-dependent. It's influenced by sleep, stress, hunger, mood, and recent experiences. A plan made while motivated is often unrealistic when viewed from a low-energy state. This creates a mismatch between intention and execution. When the time comes to act, the internal conditions no longer match the assumptions that plan was built on. Motivation also tends to exaggerate future capacity. When you're motivated, everything seems doable. Time feels abundant. Energy feels stable. This leads to plans that require a level of consistency that isn't sustainable. When reality reasserts itself, the plan collapses and motivation is blamed, even though the real issue was overconfidence during the planning phase. There's also the problem of motivation being reactive rather than proactive. It responds to feelings, not structures. If you wait to feel motivated before acting, you're letting fluctuating internal states decide your behaviour. That means consistency becomes unpredictable by definition. Some days the feeling is there, some days it isn't. There's no stable pattern to build on. This is why advice like, just do it even when you don't feel like it, sounds appealing but rarely works long term. It ignores the cost of repeated effort under resistance. Acting without motivation requires cognitive control, which is metabolically expensive. The brain doesn't like spending that energy unless it has to. If every action depends on pushing through internal resistance, fatigue accumulates. Eventually, something gives. Another overlooked aspect is that motivation is often fueled by emotion, especially frustration and hope. Frustration with the current situation pushes people to change. Hope about a better future pulls them forward, but both emotions are unstable. Frustration can turn into resignation. Hope can fade into doubt. When those emotions shift, motivation shifts with them. Motivation also competes with comfort. The brain is constantly balancing effort against perceived reward. When the reward is distant or abstract and the effort is immediate, comfort usually wins. This isn't a moral failing, it's a basic cost-benefit calculation. Immediate relief feels more valuable than long-term gain, especially when energy is low. This is why motivation tends to disappear precisely when consistency is most needed. The early phase doesn't require much discipline because motivation is high. The later phase requires discipline because motivation is low. But if discipline has been defined as motivation, there's nothing left to rely on when motivation drops. The system collapses under its own definition. Another problem is that motivation is often tied to identity in unhelpful ways. People say things like, "I'm just not motivated," as if motivation were a personality trait. This turns a temporary state into a permanent label. Once that label sticks, effort feels pointless. Why try if this is just how you are? In reality, motivation varies widely within the same person depending on context. Treating it as fixed obscures that variability. There's also a cultural issue. Motivation is celebrated. We share motivational quotes, videos, and stories of sudden transformation. These narratives focus on the spark, not the process. They make it seem like the hardest part is getting motivated, when in reality the hardest part is continuing after motivation is gone. The cultural emphasis on motivation sets people up to fail by encouraging them to rely on the least reliable part of the system. If you look at behaviors that are truly consistent, motivation is rarely involved. People don't need to feel motivated to follow habits that are deeply embedded. They act because the behavior is the default. It's cued by the environment, reinforced by routine, and requires minimal decision-making. Motivation is irrelevant in those cases. That should tell us something important. Another issue is that motivation often works against consistency by encouraging intensity over sustainability. Motivated states push people to do more than necessary. They start too strong, change too much at once, and burn through energy quickly. When motivation fades, the contrast feels dramatic. What might have been a manageable routine becomes unsustainable, and the habit collapses entirely. Motivation also doesn't account for recovery. It assumes a steady upward trajectory. When progress stalls or reverses, motivation drops sharply. There's no built-in mechanism for dealing with disruption. Without motivation, people feel lost. They don't know how to continue in a reduced capacity, so they stop altogether. The brain also learns from experience. If motivation repeatedly leads to overcommitment followed by failure, the brain starts to associate motivation with disappointment. This can create resistance to even starting. The initial spark becomes less appealing because it predicts another cycle of effort and collapse. At that point, people often say they've lost motivation, when what they've really lost is trust in the pattern. Another subtle trap is using motivation as a diagnostic tool. People ask, "Why don't I feel motivated?" instead of asking, "What is making this behavior hard to repeat?" The first question leads inward, towards self-analysis and self-blame. The second leads outward towards structure, environment, and constraints. One keeps you stuck, the other creates options. Motivation also narrows attention. When you're motivated, you focus on the goal, not the process. That can be useful early on, but it prevents learning. You don't notice friction points because the energy carries you over them. When motivation disappears, those friction points suddenly feel overwhelming because they were never addressed. This is why motivation feels like it lets you down. It works when it's present and vanishes when it's needed most, but from a biological perspective, It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's a signal, not a support beam. Treating it like a foundation guarantees collapse. The shift that changes everything is understanding that consistency must survive low motivation. That doesn't mean forcing yourself through misery. It means designing behavior so that motivation is optional. That requires reducing effort, minimizing decisions, and aligning habits with existing routines and cues. It requires acknowledging energy limits instead of pretending they don't exist. Once motivation is demoted from driver to bonus, consistency becomes less dramatic but more reliable. The question stops being how to stay motivated and starts being how to make action easier when motivation is absent. That question leads naturally into the next issue, which is deeply uncomfortable for many people to accept, that the brain's primary job is not self-improvement or discipline, but conserving energy, even when that directly conflicts with the goals we care about. The human brain is often described as a problem-solving machine, a learning machine, or even a meaning-making machine. In the context of discipline, it's usually described as something that should be trained to form good habits and override bad ones. But none of those descriptions get to the core of what the brain is actually optimized to do. At its most basic level, the brain's primary job is energy management. Everything else, including learning, planning, and habit formation, is secondary to that goal. If you don't understand this, discipline will always feel like a fight against yourself, because in a very real sense that's what it becomes. The brain consumes a disproportionate amount of the body's energy. Although it makes up only a small percentage of total body weight, it uses roughly 20% of the body's energy at rest. From an evolutionary standpoint, that makes it expensive tissue. Expensive systems evolve constraints. They become efficient, conservative, and selective about when they expend effort. The brain did not evolve to pursue long-term abstract goals like daily workouts, consistent journaling, or perfectly regulated sleep schedules. It evolved to keep you alive in environments where energy scarcity was the rule, not the exception. This means that effort is not neutral. Every action has a metabolic cost. Thinking deeply, making decisions, overriding impulses, and sustaining attention all require energy. When people talk about mental exhaustion, they're not speaking metaphorically. The brain tracks effort and tries to minimize it whenever possible. From the brain's perspective, unnecessary effort is a liability. This is where a lot of modern discipline advice goes wrong. It assumes that repetition alone will build habits, as if the brain were a neutral recorder waiting to be programmed. In reality, the brain constantly evaluates whether a behavior is worth its cost. If a habit requires sustained effort without immediate payoff, the brain will resist automating it. Not because it's malicious or lazy, but because automation is reserved for behaviors that reliably reduce effort in the long run. Habits form when a behavior consistently saves energy, not when it consistently requires it. This is a critical distinction. Brushing your teeth doesn't feel like discipline because it's efficient. It happens at the same time, in the same place. With minimal decision-making, the behavior is cued by context and completed almost automatically. There's no debate, no weighing of pros and cons, no emotional friction. The brain approves because the cost is low and the structure is stable. Compare that to habits people struggle with. Exercise routines that require changing clothes, traveling somewhere, deciding what to do, and tolerating discomfort. Writing habits that depend on creativity, focus, and emotional exposure. Dietary changes that require constant inhibition and choice. These behaviors are expensive. They demand attention, planning, and self-control. From the brain's perspective, they are not obvious candidates for automation. This is why consistency often collapses when people are tired or stressed. Under stress, the brain becomes even more conservative with energy. It prioritizes immediate demands and familiar behaviors. Long-term goals are temporarily deprioritized because they don't help resolve the current threat or pressure. This isn't a failure of discipline, it's a shift in resource allocation. Another important point is that the brain doesn't distinguish between physical and mental effort, in the way we tend to. Cognitive effort is still effort. Deciding to do something you don't feel like doing is metabolically costly. Each time you override resistance, you're spending energy. If your system is set up so that consistency depends on frequent overrides, you're guaranteeing burnout. This is why relying on willpower is so fragile. Willpower is essentially the brain forcing itself to spend energy against its own conservation instincts. It can do this temporarily, especially when motivated by emotion or urgency, but it cannot do it indefinitely. When people say they ran out of willpower, what they're describing is a system that exceeded its sustainable energy budget. The brain also learns from these experiences. If a behavior repeatedly leads to energy depletion without immediate benefit, the brain will start generating resistance earlier and more strongly next time. This resistance can feel like procrastination, avoidance, or lack of motivation, but it's better understood as predictive energy management. The brain is saying, based on past data, that this action is costly and not immediately rewarding. This becomes especially clear when you look at how habits form more easily around convenience. Behaviors that are already close to existing routines are easier to maintain because they piggyback on established energy flows. Adding a short walk after an existing activity is easier than creating a standalone exercise block. Writing a few sentences after opening a laptop is easier than scheduling a dedicated writing session. The brain favours continuity because it minimises switching costs. Switching tasks is expensive. Each transition requires reorientation, decision-making, and inhibition of the previous activity. The more transitions a habit requires, the more energy it costs. Many consistency problems are actually transition problems. The habit itself might not be that difficult, but getting into it is. Discipline advice rarely addresses this, focusing instead on internal resolve. The brain is also deeply influenced by predictability. Predictable environments reduce cognitive load. When a behavior happens under the same conditions repeatedly, the brain can anticipate it and allocate energy more efficiently. When conditions vary, the brain has to reassess each time, increasing effort. This is why inconsistent schedules make consistency harder. The brain can't optimize for chaos. Another factor is that the brain values immediate energy savings over future energy savings. Even if a habit would make life easier in the long run, the brain discounts that benefit if the immediate cost is high. This is known as temporal discounting. It's not irrational. In environments where survival was uncertain, future benefits were not guaranteed. The brain evolved to prioritize what mattered now. This creates a mismatch with modern goals, which often have delayed rewards. Exercising today doesn't make you healthier tomorrow in a way you can feel. Studying today doesn't immediately produce competence. Saving money today doesn't feel like security. These behaviors require trusting a future payoff, which the brain is not naturally inclined to do without reinforcement. Another misunderstanding is the idea that habits, once formed, require no energy. In reality, habits reduce energy cost relative to deliberate action, but they are not free. Under certain conditions, even automated behaviors can break down. Fatigue, illness, emotional stress, and environmental changes can all disrupt habits. When that happens, people often interpret it as failure rather than as a predictable response to altered conditions. The brain also adapts quickly. What initially feels effortful can become easier, but what feels easy can also become effortful if conditions change. This means consistency is not a permanent achievement. It's a dynamic process that depends on ongoing alignment between behavior and energy availability. This perspective also explains why people can be highly disciplined in some areas and not others. The areas where consistency exists are usually supported by structure, routine, and low friction. The areas where consistency fails are usually expensive, poorly supported, or in conflict with other demands. This isn't a contradiction. It's evidence of how selective the brain is about where it invests energy. When discipline is framed as a moral issue, people miss all of this. They try to push harder instead of making things easier. They increase effort instead of reducing cost. Over time, this leads to chronic fatigue, resentment toward the habit, and eventually disengagement. Understanding the brain's real job changes the strategy entirely. Instead of asking how to force yourself to be consistent, the more useful question becomes how to design behaviors that the brain is willing to support. That means lowering the energy cost, reducing decision points, stabilizing cues, and aligning habits with existing routines. It also means accepting that some days consistency will look smaller than others. A reduced version of a habit is often better than none, not because of discipline points, but because it maintains continuity. Continuity is what the brain responds to. Large gaps force reactivation, which is costly. Small actions keep the system warm. This approach removes a lot of unnecessary self-judgment. When inconsistency happens, it's no longer evidence of weakness, it's information. Something in the system became too expensive. That information can be used to adjust the environment, the expectations, or the habit itself. Once you see discipline through the lens of energy conservation, a lot of advice starts to look backward. Telling people to push through ignores the limits of the system. Praising extreme consistency without examining cost glorifies unsustainable behavior. Real consistency is quieter. It's built on alignment, not force. As this becomes clearer, it also becomes obvious why certain popular ideas about discipline don't hold up, especially the belief that willpower is something you can simply strengthen through use. If the brain's priority is to conserve energy, then repeatedly relying on willpower doesn't train discipline, it trains resistance. And that brings us directly into the next issue, which is the persistent myth that willpower functions like a muscle. When in practice, it behaves much more like a finite and highly conditional resource. Consistency is often described as if it should feel neutral, or at least manageable once you understand the right principles. There's an unspoken assumption in many discussions that if you're struggling, you must be doing something wrong, misunderstanding the process, or lacking some internal quality that others have figured out. But there's a simpler and more uncomfortable truth that rarely gets stated plainly. Consistency feels hard because it actually is hard, not in a dramatic or heroic sense, but in a very practical, mechanical sense rooted in how human systems operate over time. Repeating the same behavior day after day requires stability across multiple variables at once. Energy levels, emotional state, attention, environment, time availability, and competing demands all need to line up often enough for the behavior to persist. That alignment is fragile. Even small disruptions can break it. A slightly worse night of sleep, an unexpected obligation, a minor emotional shift or a change in routine can be enough to derail something that was working the week before. The fact that consistency collapses under these conditions doesn't mean the behavior was poorly chosen. It means the system supporting it was sensitive to disruption. One reason consistency feels harder than expected is that humans tend to underestimate variability. When you imagine staying consistent, you usually imagine an average day. You picture yourself with a reasonable amount of energy, a predictable schedule, and no major surprises. But real life isn't built out of average days. It's built out of fluctuating ones. Some days are easier, some are harder, and some are simply incompatible with the plan you had in mind. Consistency requires surviving not just good conditions, but bad ones as well. Another factor is that consistency exposes friction that novelty hides. At the beginning of a habit, excitement smooths over obstacles. You don't notice how inconvenient the timing is, how many steps are involved, or how much mental effort it takes to get started. As repetition sets in, those frictions become more noticeable. What once felt simple now feels heavy, not because the behavior changed, but because the buffer that made it feel light is gone. There's also the cumulative nature of effort. Even small actions require some level of initiation. When you repeat that initiation every day, the cost adds up. The brain tracks this accumulation. It remembers how often you've had to push, decide, or override resistance. Over time, the same action can start to feel heavier, even if it hasn't objectively changed. This is not weakness, it's accounting. Consistency also requires tolerance for boredom. Once a behavior becomes routine, it stops providing stimulation. There's nothing new to learn, nothing exciting to discover. You're just repeating the same thing again. Many people underestimate how uncomfortable this is. The brain is wired to respond to novelty. Repetition without variation offers very little reward. Choosing to continue anyway requires a kind of patience that isn't often acknowledged or trained. Another reason consistency feels difficult is that it competes with flexibility. Humans are adaptable creatures. We're good at responding to change, adjusting plans, and prioritizing new information. Consistency asks you to do the opposite. It asks you to keep doing something even when circumstances shift. That tension creates discomfort. It can feel rigid, even when the goal is reasonable. This is especially true for people whose lives are unpredictable. The more variation you have in your schedule, the more effort consistency requires. There's also a psychological cost to repetition. When you commit to doing something regularly, you remove choice. Choice can be exhausting, but it also provides a sense of freedom. Consistency replaces freedom with obligation. Even self-chosen obligations can start to feel heavy over time. The mind doesn't always distinguish between external pressure and internal commitment. Both register as demands. This is why consistency often triggers subtle resistance. It's not always dramatic avoidance. Sometimes it's just a delay, a distraction, or a rationalization. The brain looks for ways to reclaim flexibility and reduce pressure. This doesn't mean the habit is wrong. It means the demand is being felt. Consistency also amplifies self-evaluation. When you repeat a behavior, you create more opportunities to judge yourself. Did I do it well enough? Did I miss a day? Am I falling behind? This ongoing self-monitoring adds cognitive load. For some people, the habit itself isn't the hardest part. It's the constant awareness of whether they're succeeding or failing at it. Another overlooked difficulty is that consistency makes progress less visible. Early changes are noticeable. Later ones are subtle. When improvement slows, the effort-to-reward ratio feels worse. You're doing the same amount of work for smaller gains. Without deliberate reframing, this can feel pointless, even when the long-term benefit is real. Consistency is also hard because it requires saying no repeatedly. No to alternative uses of time. No to rest in some moments. No to impulses that offer immediate relief. Each no is a small act of inhibition, and inhibition is costly. The more often you inhibit, the more tired the system becomes. This is why consistency often breaks during periods of high demand. The inhibition budget gets spent elsewhere. Another reason consistency feels heavier over time is identity friction. Early on, you're trying something new. Later, the behavior starts to challenge how you see yourself. Am I really someone who does this every day? That question can create discomfort. Consistency asks for alignment between action and identity, and that alignment doesn't always happen smoothly. When there's a mismatch, resistance shows up. Consistency also highlights opportunity cost. Time spent on one thing is time not spent on something else. In the beginning, this trade-off feels abstract. Over time, it becomes concrete. You start to notice what you're giving up. That awareness can erode motivation, even if the original goal still matters. Another practical issue is that consistency doesn't scale linearly. What works at low frequency often doesn't work at high frequency. Doing something once a week is very different from doing it every day. The systems that support one may not support the other. People often increase frequency without adjusting structure, then wonder why things fall apart. There's also the emotional weight of interruption. Missing a day can feel disproportionately discouraging. Even when the break is small, it disrupts the sense of momentum. Restarting requires reactivation energy, which feels harder than continuing. This makes consistency fragile. The cost of stopping is often greater than the cost of continuing, but that cost is felt emotionally, not logically. Consistency also exposes the limits of control. No matter how well you plan, some things will interfere. Illness, emergencies, mood shifts, and external obligations don't respect routines. When these disruptions happen, consistency requires adaptation. Without that flexibility, the habit breaks. Adapting itself takes effort, adding another layer of difficulty. Another reason consistency feels harder than expected is that many habits are built in isolation. They're not integrated into the rest of life. They sit on top of existing responsibilities rather than fitting within them. This creates constant competition for time and energy. The habit feels like an add-on rather than a natural extension of daily life. Consistency is also emotionally demanding because it confronts you with limits. You discover how much you can realistically do, not how much you wish you could do. That discovery can be disappointing. It forces a reckoning with energy, time, and capacity. Many people would rather abandon the habit than adjust it downward, because adjustment feels like admitting failure. There's also the issue of delayed consequences. Inconsistency doesn't usually produce immediate harm. You can skip a day or a week without obvious fallout. That makes the cost of stopping feel low. Consistency, on the other hand, requires effort now for benefit later. The imbalance between immediate cost and delayed reward makes the behavior feel harder than it objectively is. All of this adds up to a simple but rarely acknowledged reality. Staying consistent is not just about doing something repeatedly. It's about maintaining alignment across changing conditions, tolerating boredom, managing energy, handling disruption, and accepting limits. That's a lot to ask of a system that evolved to prioritize flexibility and conservation. When people say consistency feels hard, they're not making excuses. They're describing an accurate experience. The mistake comes when that difficulty is interpreted as a personal failure instead of a structural challenge. Once you accept that consistency is inherently demanding, the goal stops being to make it effortless and starts being to make it survivable. That shift matters. If you expect consistency to feel easy, any resistance feels like a warning sign. If you expect it to feel effortful at times, resistance becomes information instead of a verdict. You start asking different questions. Where is this getting heavy? What's making this harder than it needs to be? What can be simplified, reduced, or supported? Consistency doesn't become easy when you understand it better, but it does become less confusing. You stop being surprised by the difficulty. You stop interpreting struggle as evidence that you're not cut out for it. And that opens the door to a more realistic approach, one that doesn't rely on forcing yourself through resistance, but instead looks closely at what kind of effort you're actually being asked to sustain. Once that perspective settles in, it becomes much harder to believe another popular idea about discipline, the idea that the main obstacle is a lack of willpower, and that if you could just strengthen it enough, consistency would finally stop feeling so heavy. Willpower is often spoken about as if it were a personal reserve that some people are born with in abundance, and others somehow missed out on. In everyday language, it's treated like a muscle you can strengthen through use, a kind of inner toughness that allows you to push through resistance, ignore distractions, and do what needs to be done no matter how you feel. When consistency breaks down, the explanation almost always points here. You didn't have enough willpower, you ran out of it. You need to build more of it. This idea is everywhere, and it sounds reasonable on the surface. But when you look closely at how willpower actually functions, the myth becomes clear, and so does the hidden cost of relying on it. Willpower is not a standalone trait. It's a temporary cognitive state that depends on attention, emotional regulation, and energy availability. Using willpower means deliberately overriding impulses, habits, or preferences in favor of a chosen action. That override process requires active control from the brain's executive systems, particularly areas involved in decision-making and self-regulation. These systems are effortful to run, They are not designed to be active continuously, and they do not operate independently of the rest of the body. One of the reasons the willpower myth persists is that it appears to work, at least in the short term. People can force themselves to do difficult things. They can wake up early, resist temptations, and stick to routines for a while. This creates the impression that willpower is a reliable tool, something you can call on whenever needed. But what's usually missing from these stories is what happens next. The fatigue, the rebound, the quiet collapse that follows sustained effort. Using willpower is metabolically expensive. The brain doesn't just decide to override an impulse without cost. It increases activity in control networks, suppresses competing signals, and maintains focus in the face of resistance. All of that consumes energy. When people talk about feeling mentally drained after a day of self-control, that sensation reflects real physiological strain. The system has been working hard to maintain behavior that doesn't come naturally in the moment. This is why willpower use is so sensitive to context. It's harder to exert self-control when you're tired, hungry, stressed, or emotionally taxed. Those states reduce the energy available for regulation. The brain becomes less willing to spend resources on override behaviors. This isn't weakness, it's prioritization. The system protects itself by scaling back costly operations when resources are low. Another problem with willpower is that it doesn't scale well. Using it occasionally is one thing. Building an entire routine that depends on daily acts of resistance is another. Each act may seem small, but over time the cumulative cost becomes significant. The brain keeps track of this accumulation. It learns that certain behaviors are consistently associated with effort and depletion. As a result, resistance starts earlier and feels stronger with each repetition. This learning process is important to understand. When a behavior repeatedly requires willpower, the brain doesn't become more accepting of it. It becomes more cautious. It predicts future cost based on past experience. That prediction shows up as reluctance, procrastination, or avoidance. People often interpret this as laziness or lack of discipline, but it's better understood as the brain protecting itself from expected strain. The idea that willpower gets stronger with use comes from an oversimplified analogy to muscle training. Muscles adapt to stress because they rebuild during recovery. Willpower does not function the same way. There is no equivalent recovery mechanism that makes repeated exertion easier over time. In many cases, repeated exertion without structural support makes future exertion harder, not easier. The brain associates the behavior with effort and becomes less inclined to initiate it. This is one reason why people often experience cycles of intense discipline followed by burnout. During the disciplined phase, willpower is used heavily to maintain consistency. Progress may happen, but it comes at a cost. Eventually, the regulatory systems become fatigued. Motivation drops, resistance increases, the person stops. Then comes guilt, followed by rest, followed by another attempt to restart the cycle using the same strategy. From the outside, it looks like inconsistency. From the inside, it's exhaustion. Another issue with willpower is that it's reactive. It responds to immediate temptation or resistance. It doesn't prevent those states from arising. This means that even with strong willpower, you still experience constant internal conflict. Every decision becomes a small battle. Over time, that conflict becomes draining. People don't just get tired of the behavior, they get tired of arguing with themselves. This internal conflict also narrows attention. When you're exerting willpower, your focus is on not doing something or forcing yourself to do something. That focus leaves less room for noticing how the behavior could be made easier. Willpower keeps you locked in a struggle instead of encouraging redesign. As long as you believe that effort is the solution, you're less likely to question why so much effort is required in the first place. There's also a psychological cost to willpower-based discipline. When success depends on constant self-control, failure feels personal. If you slip, it means you didn't try hard enough. This framing increases shame and self-criticism. Those emotions in turn make future self-control harder. Shame consumes cognitive resources and reduces motivation. The system becomes even more strained. Another overlooked aspect is that willpower competes with other demands. You don't have a separate pool of self-control for each area of life. Regulation in one domain affects regulation in others. A day full of difficult decisions, emotional labour or stress reduces your capacity to exert willpower later. This is why people often struggle with consistency in the evening. The system has already been taxed. This also explains why consistency breaks during busy or stressful periods, even for people who are usually disciplined. It's not that they suddenly lost character. Their regulatory capacity is being used elsewhere. Willpower is being spent on coping, problem-solving, and emotional management. There's less left over for optional routines. The myth of willpower encourages people to ignore this reality. It suggests that if you cared enough, you'd find the energy. But energy doesn't appear on demand, it's constrained. Treating willpower as infinite leads to overcommitment and eventual collapse. Another problem is that willpower is often used to compensate for poorly designed systems. Instead of making a habit easier, people rely on forcing themselves through friction. This works temporarily, but it doesn't change the underlying structure. When willpower inevitably falters, the habit falls apart because nothing else is supporting it. This reliance on willpower also prevents habits from becoming automatic. Automation requires consistency under low effort. If a behavior always requires conscious override, it never transitions into a lower cost state. The brain never gets the signal that this behavior is safe to run on autopilot. Willpower keeps the habit stuck in a high-effort mode. There's also an emotional backlash that can come from prolonged self-control. When people restrain themselves constantly, they often experience rebound behaviors. After a period of strict discipline, they overindulge or disengage completely. This isn't a lack of values. It's a release of pent-up regulatory pressure. The system seeks relief. This rebound effect further undermines trust in willpower. People start to feel out of control, swinging between extremes. They blame themselves for the swing, not realizing that the strategy itself is creating the instability. It's also important to note that willpower doesn't address the root causes of inconsistency. It doesn't change energy availability. It doesn't simplify routines. It doesn't reduce friction. It doesn't stabilize cues. It simply pushes through resistance. As long as those underlying factors remain unchanged, willpower is being used to fight the same battle repeatedly. Another subtle issue is that willpower-based discipline often feels virtuous. There's a sense of pride in pushing through. That pride can reinforce the strategy even when it's failing. People feel like they should be able to endure, and when they can't, the disappointment is sharper. This emotional attachment to effort makes it harder to adopt gentler, more effective approaches. Understanding the cost of willpower doesn't mean abandoning effort altogether. It means recognizing where effort belongs and where it doesn't. Willpower is best used sparingly to set up systems, make structural changes, or navigate unavoidable disruptions. It's not meant to be the daily engine of consistency. When willpower is redirected toward redesign instead of repetition, things begin to shift. Effort is spent once to reduce future effort. Choices are limited, cues are stabilized, friction is lowered. Over time, the behavior requires less active control. The brain stops predicting depletion and starts allowing the habit to run with minimal resistance. This approach feels less dramatic. There's no heroic pushing, there's no constant internal dialogue, but it's far more sustainable. Consistency becomes something that happens more often than not, rather than something that must be wrestled into existence each day. Once the myth of willpower starts to dissolve, another realization follows naturally. If discipline isn't about constant self-control, and if effort has a real cost, then the question becomes why people sometimes appear disciplined and other times don't, even within the same individual. That question points toward patterns that have less to do with character and more to do with timing, context, and internal state, which leads directly into the next idea that needs careful examination. If discipline were a stable personal trait, it would show up the same way all the time. You would either have it or you wouldn't. Your behaviour would be predictable across situations, goals, and periods of life. But that's not how discipline actually appears. Most people are disciplined sometimes and inconsistent at other times, often in ways that seem confusing or even contradictory. Someone who can reliably meet work deadlines might struggle to maintain a personal routine. Someone who exercises consistently for months might suddenly stop without a clear reason. This inconsistency isn't random, and it isn't evidence of hidden weakness. It's a reflection of how discipline depends on conditions rather than character. The first thing to understand is that discipline is not evenly distributed across domains. It's contextual. The same person can display high consistency in one area and very little in another, not because they care more about one than the other, but because the surrounding conditions are different. External structure, accountability, clarity, and immediate consequences all matter. Where those elements are present, discipline appears. Where they're absent, it fades. Consider how discipline often shows up at work. Deadlines are clear. Expectations are defined. Consequences for not following through are immediate and external. There's usually a fixed schedule and a clear start point. These features reduce decision-making and increase predictability. The brain doesn't have to negotiate whether to act. The action is required. That requirement lowers cognitive load, even though the task itself may be demanding. Now compare that to personal goals. Exercise, creative work, learning, or self-care routines often lack clear boundaries. There's no external enforcement. The timing is flexible. Consequences are delayed or abstract. Each day requires a fresh decision. That flexibility feels like freedom, but it dramatically increases the cost of consistency. The brain has to decide again and again whether the effort is worth it. Sometimes it says yes, sometimes it doesn't. This explains why discipline often appears during structured periods and disappears during unstructured ones. When routines are imposed by circumstance, such as during school terms, work projects, or training programs, consistency improves. When that structure is removed, behaviour becomes more variable. This shift is often misinterpreted as a personal failure, when it's actually a predictable response to changing constraints. Another important factor is emotional state. Discipline is easier when emotions are stable. When mood is regulated, attention is available and effort feels manageable. During periods of emotional strain, even simple tasks can feel heavy. The brain reallocates resources toward processing emotion and managing stress. Optional behaviours lose priority. This doesn't mean discipline is gone, it means capacity has shifted. This is why people often look back and say, "I used to be so disciplined." What they're really remembering is a time when conditions were more supportive, energy was higher, life was simpler, emotional load was lower. The behaviour felt easier not because they were better people, but because the system had fewer competing demands. Discipline is also influenced by how clearly defined the behaviour is. When the next action is obvious, consistency improves. When it's vague, discipline drops. Go to the gym is a broad instruction that hides many decisions. When to go, what to do, how long to stay. Each hidden decision increases friction. On days when energy is high, those decisions are manageable. On days when it's low, they become obstacles. This leads to a pattern where discipline fluctuates based on energy availability. When you're rested, fed, and mentally clear, discipline appears. When you're depleted, it disappears. This isn't because discipline is fickle, it's because it's expensive. The brain only invests in it when it believes the cost can be covered. There's also the role of timing. Discipline is often easier at certain points in the day. Many people are more consistent in the morning, not because they're more virtuous then, but because decision fatigue hasn't accumulated yet. As the day goes on, choices pile up. Each choice uses a bit of regulatory capacity. By evening, the system is less willing to exert control. This explains why people can be disciplined early in the week and inconsistent later on, or disciplined at the beginning of a routine and inconsistent after a long day. The underlying variable is not commitment, it's available regulatory bandwidth. Another reason discipline appears inconsistently is that it's sensitive to feedback. When actions produce visible results, consistency is reinforced. When results are delayed or unclear, discipline weakens. This is especially true for habits with long timelines. Early success creates momentum. Plateau creates doubt. Without feedback, effort feels less justified, and the brain becomes less willing to invest. There's also the issue of competing identities. Discipline is easier when a behavior aligns with how you see yourself in that context. At work, you may identify as reliable or professional. Acting consistently supports that identity. In personal life, the identity may be less clear or less reinforced. The behavior feels optional rather than essential. That difference matters. Discipline also depends on how much friction exists between intention and action. In environments where the path is smooth, consistency emerges naturally. In environments filled with interruptions, distractions, or obstacles, discipline requires constant correction. That correction is tiring. Over time, the system resists. This is why some people appear disciplined in controlled environments but struggle in chaotic ones. It's not hypocrisy, it's sensitivity. The brain responds to noise by conserving energy and defaulting to familiar behaviors. Another overlooked factor is recovery. Discipline requires rest. When recovery is insufficient, consistency erodes. People often try to push through fatigue instead of addressing it. This can work briefly, but it doesn't last. Eventually, the system enforces rest through disengagement. From the outside, this looks like inconsistency. From the inside, it feels like relief. There's also a memory effect. The brain remembers recent successes and failures. After a streak of consistency, confidence is higher and discipline feels easier. After a break, restarting feels harder. This creates momentum in both directions. Discipline clusters not because of personality changes, but because recent experience shapes expectation. This is why it's misleading to ask why you're disciplined sometimes, but not always. The better question is under what conditions discipline appears. When you examine that honestly, patterns emerge. Discipline shows up when structure is present, energy is sufficient, decisions are limited, and feedback exists. It disappears when those supports are removed. This perspective removes the mystery. It also removes much of the self-blame. Inconsistency stops being a character flaw and starts being a diagnostic signal. Something changed, capacity shifted, friction increased. Ignoring that signal and doubling down on effort usually makes things worse. Understanding this also explains why advice that focuses on just being disciplined feels hollow. It treats discipline as a switch you can flip instead of an outcome of interacting variables. It ignores timing, environment, emotional load, and recovery. Once you see discipline as conditional, not constant, a different strategy becomes possible. Instead of trying to be disciplined all the time, you can focus on creating conditions where discipline is more likely to appear. That means designing routines that fit low-energy days, reducing decisions, stabilizing cues, and building in flexibility for disruption. It also means letting go of the expectation that consistency should be perfect. Discipline doesn't need to be constant to be effective. It needs to be resilient. It needs to survive fluctuation, not eliminate it. As this idea settles, it naturally raises another question that many people avoid because it feels uncomfortable. If discipline depends so heavily on conditions, then what role do emotions play in quietly undermining consistency, even when everything else seems reasonable? That question points toward forces that operate beneath awareness, influencing behavior without obvious warning, and understanding those forces becomes essential for making consistency less fragile over time. Emotion plays a far larger role in consistency than most people realize, not because emotions are dramatic or overwhelming all the time, but because they operate quietly in the background, shaping decisions before those decisions ever feel conscious. When people talk about discipline breaking down, they often describe practical problems. They didn't have time, they forgot, they were too tired. But underneath those explanations, emotional states are often doing the real work, nudging behavior in subtle directions that feel reasonable in the moment and only obvious in hindsight. One reason emotion is so influential is that it affects how effort feels. The same task can feel manageable one day and unbearable the next, even if nothing about the task itself has changed. What changed is the emotional context in which it's being evaluated. When mood is low, effort feels heavier. When mood is stable or positive, the same effort feels lighter. This shift happens automatically. The brain uses emotional signals as shortcuts for deciding what's worth doing. If something feels emotionally costly, the brain treats it as risky or unnecessary, regardless of its long-term value. This is why consistency often breaks during periods of emotional strain, even when people are highly motivated in principle. Stress, sadness, frustration, boredom, and anxiety all consume cognitive resources. They narrow attention and reduce tolerance for additional demands. When emotional load is high, the brain prioritizes relief. That relief might come in the form of rest, distraction, comfort behaviors, or avoidance. Long-term goals don't disappear, but they lose urgency. What makes this especially difficult to recognize is that emotional influence doesn't usually announce itself. People don't think, "I'm not exercising today because I feel discouraged." Instead, they think, "Today isn't a good day," or "I'll do it tomorrow." The emotional state provides the justification, not the explanation. Because the reasoning sounds practical, the emotional cause remains invisible. Another factor is that emotions distort time perception. When you're emotionally taxed, future benefits feel further away. The reward of consistency becomes abstract, while the discomfort of effort feels immediate. This imbalance makes long-term effort feel less rational, even when it isn't. The brain isn't doing a moral calculation. It's responding to how things feel right now. Emotion also influences self-talk, which in turn affects consistency. When mood is stable, setbacks are interpreted as temporary. When mood is low, the same setbacks are interpreted as evidence of failure. This shift in interpretation matters. If missing one day feels like proof that you're not capable, restarting becomes emotionally costly. Avoidance becomes a form of self-protection. This is how emotion quietly turns small disruptions into full stops. The behavior didn't break because the routine was impossible. It broke because restarting carried emotional weight. Shame, disappointment, or frustration made the next step feel heavier than the original effort. Over time, the brain learns to associate the habit not just with effort, but with negative emotion. Resistance grows. Another subtle way emotion sabotages consistency is through emotional relief behaviors. When people feel overwhelmed or depleted, they naturally gravitate toward activities that offer quick comfort. Scrolling, snacking, entertainment, and disengagement all provide immediate emotional regulation. These behaviors aren't bad in themselves. They serve a purpose, but they compete directly with habits that require effort without offering immediate emotional payoff. The brain doesn't evaluate these options based on long-term outcomes. It evaluates them based on how well they regulate emotion in the moment. If a habit doesn't help regulate emotion, it's at a disadvantage during emotionally difficult periods. This is why consistency often holds during calm periods and collapses during stressful ones. Emotion also affects how people interpret effort itself. When emotionally regulated, effort feels like progress. When emotionally dysregulated, the same effort feels pointless. This isn't because the effort actually lost value, but because the emotional context changed the meaning assigned to it. Meaning matters. Without it, repetition feels empty. There's also the role of emotional anticipation. Before starting a habit, the brain predicts how it will feel. If past experiences included frustration, boredom, or self-criticism, those emotions get baked into the prediction. The brain resists not the behavior, but the anticipated emotional state. This resistance can feel like procrastination or avoidance, but it's driven by emotional memory. This is why habits that are technically simple can feel emotionally heavy. The emotional history attached to them matters more than the action itself. A short walk can feel harder than a long work task if it's associated with guilt, pressure, or self-judgment. Emotion shapes perceived cost. Another important point is that emotions fluctuate independently of intention. You can want to stay consistent and still feel unmotivated, irritable, or flat. Expecting emotion to cooperate with long-term plans is unrealistic. Emotion responds to sleep, hormones, stress, social interaction, and countless other variables. It doesn't check in with your goals before shifting. This creates a problem when consistency is built on emotional alignment. If you only act when you feel good about acting, behavior becomes unpredictable. Emotional states change faster than routines can adapt. This doesn't mean emotion should be ignored, but it does mean they shouldn't be the primary driver of action. Emotion also affects attention. When emotions are intense, attention narrows. The brain focuses on what feels most pressing. Long-term goals fade into the background. This is not a conscious choice. It's a protective mechanism. When something feels emotionally urgent, the system prioritizes it. This helps explain why consistency often breaks during emotionally charged life events. Even positive emotions can disrupt routines. Excitement, anticipation, and social engagement all redirect attention. Consistency requires sustained focus on something that may not feel emotionally relevant in the moment. Another way emotion interferes is through all-or-nothing thinking. Emotional states amplify extremes. A small slip feels like total failure. A minor success feels like proof that everything is back on track. This volatility makes consistency fragile. Each emotional swing creates pressure to either recommit fully or disengage completely. This pattern is reinforced by how people talk to themselves. Emotional self-talk tends to be absolute. I always mess this up. I can never stay consistent. These statements feel true in the moment, but they're products of emotional reasoning, not evidence. Once internalized, they shape future behavior by lowering expectations and increasing resistance. Emotion also affects patience. Long-term effort requires waiting. Waiting is emotionally uncomfortable, especially when progress is slow. Impatience is not just a personality trait. It's an emotional response to delayed gratification. When impatience rises, consistency feels unrewarding. The brain looks for alternatives that offer quicker relief. This is why habits with visible short-term rewards are easier to maintain. They provide emotional feedback. Habits without that feedback require emotional tolerance. Without support, that tolerance wears down. Another often ignored aspect is emotional exhaustion. People talk about physical tiredness, but emotional fatigue is just as real. Managing relationships, stress, uncertainty, and self-expectations all consume emotional energy. When that energy is low, even small demands feel intrusive. Consistency suffers not because of lack of discipline, but because emotional capacity has been exceeded. There's also a social component. Emotions are influenced by comparison. Seeing others appear consistent can trigger discouragement. Discouragement reduces effort. The brain interprets comparison as threat to self-image. Protecting self-image becomes more important than maintaining a routine. Avoidance follows. Emotion also shapes how people recover from breaks. A missed day followed by self-compassion leads to quick resumption. A missed day followed by self-criticism leads to delay. The behavior is the same. The emotional response determines the outcome. This is why emotional regulation matters more for consistency than sheer determination. The ability to tolerate discomfort, disappointment, boredom, and uncertainty without overreacting determines whether effort continues or stops. This tolerance is rarely taught. Instead, people are told to push harder, which often worsens emotional strain. Understanding the emotional layer of consistency changes how setbacks are interpreted. Instead of asking why you failed, the more useful question becomes what emotional state was present when things started to slip. Was there fatigue, frustration, overwhelm, boredom? Identifying that state provides information. Ignoring it guarantees repetition. Emotion doesn't sabotage consistency out of spite. It does it because the brain prioritizes emotional regulation. When a habit threatens emotional balance, even subtly, the brain intervenes. That intervention feels like loss of discipline, but it's actually protection. The goal is not to eliminate emotion from the process. That's impossible. The goal is to design routines that are emotionally tolerable even on difficult days. That means lowering stakes, reducing self-judgment, and allowing flexibility without collapse. It also means separating identity from performance, so emotions don't get tangled up with self-worth. Once this becomes clear, it's easier to see why some habits never stick, no matter how well they're planned. They may be structurally sound, but emotionally unsustainable, and that realization points toward another critical issue that quietly undermines consistency, one that operates not at the level of feelings, but at the level of self-concept, where routines either align with who you believe you are or constantly fight against that belief. When people talk about habits not sticking, they usually focus on the routine itself. The schedule wasn't right, the plan was too ambitious, life got in the way. Those explanations aren't wrong, but they stop one layer too early. Beneath routine, beneath effort, beneath even emotion, there's a quieter force that determines whether a behavior integrates into daily life or keeps slipping out of it. That force is identity, not in a dramatic sense, and not as a motivational slogan, but as a practical internal model the brain uses to decide what feels natural, expected, and worth maintaining. Every person carries an implicit sense of who they are. This sense isn't a fixed story you consciously repeat to yourself. It's a collection of assumptions built from past behavior, social feedback, and repeated experiences. The brain uses this identity model to predict what actions are likely and which ones are out of character. When a behavior fits that model, it requires less effort to repeat. When it conflicts with the model, the brain treats it as temporary or conditional, something that needs justification every time. This is one of the main reasons habits don't stick even when the routine itself seems reasonable. You can follow a routine for a while without it becoming part of your identity. During that time, the behavior feels external, like something you're doing rather than something you are. As long as it stays in that category, it remains fragile. It depends on motivation, willpower, or favourable conditions. The moment those supports weaken, the habit drops away. Identity-based behaviours feel different. They don't require the same internal negotiation. A person who sees themselves as someone who shows up to work doesn't debate whether to go in most days. The behaviour aligns with expectation. When identity and action match, the brain doesn't need to spend energy resolving the conflict. When they don't match, resistance appears. This mismatch is often subtle. People don't think, this habit conflicts with my identity. They think, I don't feel like doing this today, or this isn't really me. That feeling isn't random. It's the brain comparing current behaviour to its internal model and flagging inconsistency. One reason routines fail to become identity aligned is that they're often introduced as temporary fixes. People say, I'm going to try this, or I'll do this until I reach my goal. That framing matters. It signals to the brain that the behaviour is provisional. Temporary behaviours are not integrated, they're tolerated. Once the initial reason fades, or the goal feels distant, the behaviour loses its justification. Another issue is that identity is built from evidence, not intention. You don't become someone who does something by deciding it once. You become that person by doing it enough times under varied conditions that the brain updates its expectations. This update process is slow. It doesn't respond well to bursts of intensity followed by collapse. In fact, those cycles reinforce the opposite identity. They teach the brain that this is something you do briefly, and then abandon. This is why people who go through repeated cycles of starting and stopping often feel stuck. Each restart feels harder than the last, not because the habit is harder, but because the identity evidence is stacking in the wrong direction. The brain predicts inconsistency because inconsistency has been the pattern. Another overlooked factor is that identity is context-specific. You don't have one global identity. You have multiple identity models depending on situation. Who you are at work is not identical to who you are at home. Who you are alone is not identical to who you are socially. Habits that fit one context may feel unnatural in another. This is why people can be consistent in structured environments and inconsistent elsewhere. The behavior fits one identity model but not the other. Routines also fail to stick when they clash with existing self-descriptions. Someone who sees themselves as spontaneous may resist rigid routines, even if those routines are helpful. Someone who sees themselves as low energy may resist habits framed around intensity. The resistance isn't logical, but it's predictable. The brain avoids actions that threaten coherence. Maintaining a stable sense of self is a priority. This doesn't mean identity can't change. It means identity changes through behavior, not through declarations. The brain updates identity when it sees consistent evidence that contradicts the old model. But that evidence has to be believable. Extreme routines often fail because they produce behavior that feels implausible given the existing identity. The brain treats them as exceptions, not updates. This is where many habit strategies backfire. People try to become a radically different version of themselves overnight. They adopt routines that reflect an ideal identity rather than a realistic one. When the behavior inevitably collapses, the brain reinforces the original identity instead. See, it concludes, this isn't who we are. Identity conflict also increases emotional friction. Acting out of alignment with self-concept creates discomfort. That discomfort doesn't always feel like resistance. It can feel like embarrassment, self-consciousness, or subtle avoidance. Over time, the brain learns to avoid that discomfort by avoiding the behavior. Another important point is that identity is shaped by language. How you talk about yourself matters. Statements like, "I'm bad at routines" or "I'm just not disciplined" aren't neutral observations. They become part of the identity model. Once those labels are in place, behaviors that contradict them feel unstable. The brain resists updating because it prefers consistency. This doesn't mean positive affirmations solve the problem. Simply telling yourself a new story without behavioral evidence doesn't work. The brain prioritizes experience over narration. What does work is changing the scale of behavior so that new evidence can accumulate without triggering identity conflict. Small, consistent actions are more effective for identity change than large, inconsistent ones. Doing something minimal but repeatable sends a different signal than doing something intense and unsustainable. The brain starts to adjust its predictions. We seem to do this now, it notes, cautiously at first. Over time, that caution fades. Another reason habits don't stick is that people often separate routine from meaning. The behavior becomes mechanical, disconnected from values. When that happens, identity integration stalls. The brain doesn't just track frequency, it tracks relevance. Behaviors that feel meaningless don't become self-defining, no matter how often they're repeated. At the same time, meaning doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be personal. A habit tied to how you want to show up in daily life integrates more easily than one tied to abstract goals. Identity operates at the level of lived experience, not long-term outcomes. There's also the role of social reinforcement. Identity is shaped in part by how others respond to you. When a behavior is acknowledged, mirrored, or expected by others, it integrates faster. When it's invisible or unsupported, it remains fragile. This is why habits maintained in isolation are harder to sustain. Another subtle issue is that identity resists constant evaluation. When habits are tracked obsessively, they stay in the foreground of attention. This can prevent them from becoming natural. Paradoxically, some habits stick better when they're no longer treated as projects. The less you think about them, the more they feel like part of who you are. Identity also interacts with failure in important ways. A missed day doesn't threaten a routine as much as it threatens an identity. If the identity is strong, the behaviour resumes easily. If the identity is weak, the miss feels like proof that the habit never belonged. This is why recovery matters more than streaks. Recovery reinforces identity. Streaks without recovery don't. Many people unknowingly sabotage identity integration by framing habits as tests. Did I succeed today? Did I fail? This framing keeps the behaviour conditional. Identity doesn't update under constant judgment. It updates under normalcy. The behaviour has to feel expected, not exceptional. This also explains why habits often stick better when they're boring. Boring behaviours don't trigger identity drama. They slide into daily life quietly. There's no pressure to perform or prove anything. The brain accepts them as background processes. Another important distinction is between aspirational identity and functional identity. Aspirational identity is who you want to be. Functional identity is who you actually are based on repeated behaviour. Habits fail when they're built to satisfy aspiration without respecting function. The gap between the two creates friction. Bridging that gap requires honesty. What can you realistically do most days, not on your best days? What version of the habit can survive low energy, distraction, and emotional noise? That version may feel unimpressive, but it's far more likely to integrate. Identity doesn't update in response to ideals, it updates in response to patterns. When the pattern changes, identity follows. This process is slow and unspectacular, which is why it's often overlooked. People look for dramatic transformation and miss gradual integration. Once a habit becomes identity aligned, it feels less like discipline. You still expend effort, but you don't argue with yourself as much. The behaviour feels expected. Skipping it feels slightly off, not catastrophic, but noticeable. That feeling is not guilt, it's mismatch. And mismatch is easier to correct than shame. Understanding the role of identity clarifies why routines alone aren't enough. Without identity integration, routines remain vulnerable to stress, emotion, and disruption. With identity integration, even imperfect routines have staying power. This also explains why change often feels slow and uneven. Identity doesn't update all at once, it updates in fragments. You become someone who sometimes does the thing, then often does it, then usually does it. Expecting a clean switch misses how the process actually unfolds. As this becomes clearer, another obstacle comes into focus. Even when a habit aligns with identity, even when emotion is regulated and effort is reasonable, there's still a powerful force that quietly undermines consistency for many people. That force isn't internal at all. It's the comfort of the familiar environment, which stabilizes behavior just as effectively as discipline does, and often in the opposite direction. Comfort is usually treated as the reward at the end of effort. You work hard, stay disciplined, push through resistance, and eventually you earn rest, ease, and stability. That framing makes comfort sound harmless, even desirable. And in many ways, it is. The nervous system needs periods of stability to recover. Predictability lowers stress. Familiar routines reduce cognitive load. But comfort has a second side that is rarely acknowledged, and that side is where consistency quietly breaks down. Comfort doesn't just restore energy, it also anchors behaviour. Once behaviour stabilizes around comfort, change starts to feel unnecessary, intrusive, or even threatening. The brain is exceptionally good at adapting to whatever environment it finds itself in. Over time, what was once uncomfortable becomes normal. What was once difficult becomes familiar. This adaptation is efficient and protective. It allows you to function without constantly reassessing every detail of your life. But that same efficiency creates a trap. Once a stable pattern is established, the brain treats it as the baseline. Any deviation from that baseline, even a positive one, is evaluated as a cost. This is why consistency often fails not at the beginning, but after things start to feel okay. When life is chaotic or uncomfortable, people are more willing to change. Discomfort creates urgency. It signals that something isn't working. In those moments, effort feels justified. But when things stabilize, when discomfort fades just enough, urgency disappears. The brain relaxes. It says, "We're fine here." That assessment may be incomplete, but it's convincing. This is the comfort trap. It's not laziness, and it's not lack of ambition. It's the brain protecting a stable state. Once stability is achieved, even partially, the motivation to disrupt it drops sharply. The effort required to maintain or improve consistency starts to feel optional rather than necessary. Comfort also narrows perspective. When things are stable, long-term risks feel distant. Small inconsistencies don't seem consequential. Skipping a routine once or twice doesn't produce immediate harm. The absence of negative feedback reinforces the idea that the routine wasn't essential after all. Over time, this erodes commitment without any dramatic moment of failure. Another aspect of the comfort trap is that stability reduces contrast. Early in a habit, the difference between effort and rest is obvious. Progress feels meaningful because it's new. As the habit becomes part of the background, that contrast fades. The effort remains, but the sense of improvement doesn't. Without contrast, effort feels less justified. The brain starts asking why it's still necessary. Comfort also affects how people interpret fatigue. When you're in a stable routine, any increase in effort stands out more. A tired day feels more disruptive because it breaks the expectation of smooth functioning. Instead of being seen as a normal fluctuation, fatigue is treated as a reason to pause. Pausing feels reasonable. After all, things are already okay. This is why consistency often breaks during calm periods rather than stressful ones. During stress, routines can feel grounding. During calm, they can feel excessive. The brain prefers to coast when it can. Coasting conserves energy. From an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. There's no reason to expend effort when there's no immediate need. Comfort also reinforces existing identity. Once a certain way of living feels normal, changing it requires questioning that normal. That questioning creates discomfort. Even positive changes introduce uncertainty. The brain weighs that uncertainty against the perceived benefit. If the benefit isn't urgent, comfort wins. Another important element of the comfort trap is that it operates gradually. There's no clear point where someone decides to stop being consistent. Instead, the effort softens, standards loosen, exceptions become frequent. Each change feels minor and justified. Because nothing bad happens right away, the pattern continues. By the time the habit has faded, it feels like it happened on its own. Comfort also interacts with emotion in subtle ways. When life feels manageable, people are less tolerant of discomfort. The same effort that felt acceptable during hard times now feels annoying. The emotional threshold for inconvenience drops. This isn't entitlement, it's recalibration. The brain adjusts its tolerance based on recent experience. This recalibration makes it harder to restart once consistency slips. After a period of comfort, effort feels heavier than it did before. The brain has updated its expectations. What was once normal now feels like a disruption. Restarting requires more activation energy than continuing would have. Another overlooked aspect is that comfort can disguise stagnation. When things are stable, lack of progress doesn't feel alarming. You're not failing, you're just maintaining. Maintenance feels safe, but long-term goals require movement, not just stability. Without intentional pressure, maintenance slowly replaces growth. Comfort also reduces feedback. When routines are no longer tracked or reflected on, small deviations go unnoticed. Without feedback, the brain doesn't register a problem. By the time consequences appear, they feel sudden and discouraging even though the decline was gradual. The comfort trap is reinforced by modern environments that make comfort easy to maintain. Entertainment, food, temperature control, and convenience all support staying exactly where you are. These systems are not neutral. They reward stillness. They reduce friction for passive behavior. In that context, consistency that requires effort is always swimming upstream. Another issue is that comfort creates a false sense of completion. People feel like they've earned rest indefinitely. The effort that built stability is treated as a finished task rather than an ongoing process. This mindset makes consistency feel optional once a certain level is reached. Comfort also alters goal perception. Goals that once felt necessary start to feel like extras. Exercise becomes something you do when you have time. Creative work becomes something you return to when inspired. The structure dissolves. Without structure, discipline depends on motivation, which we already know is unreliable. This trap is particularly strong for habits that don't produce immediate negative consequences when stopped. You can stop exercising for weeks before you feel a difference. You can stop learning for months before the cost becomes obvious. Comfort fills the gap between action and consequence, making inconsistency feel harmless. There's also a social dimension. When the people around you are comfortable, deviation feels unnecessary. Consistency that requires effort can feel out of place. Without explicit support, the path of least resistance becomes conformity to the local norm. Comfort also affects self-evaluation. When things are stable, people are less forgiving of struggle. They expect themselves to function smoothly. When effort becomes noticeable, it's interpreted as a problem rather than a normal part of growth. This interpretation increases resistance. Another subtle mechanism is that comfort reduces urgency cues. The brain responds strongly to signals that something needs attention now. Comfort removes those signals. Without urgency, action feels deferrable. Tomorrow feels just as good as today. Over time, tomorrow never arrives. This is why waiting until you feel uncomfortable enough to change is unreliable. Comfort can persist long enough to undermine consistency without triggering action. By the time discomfort returns, the habit is already gone. Escaping the comfort trap doesn't mean rejecting comfort altogether. That would be unsustainable. It means recognizing that comfort is not a neutral state. It actively shapes behavior. Once you see that, you can stop mistaking comfort for completion. One effective shift is to redefine consistency, not as constant effort, but as continued engagement. Engagement can be light, it can be imperfect, but it maintains a thread. That thread prevents comfort from fully settling into stagnation. Another shift is to build habits that tolerate comfort instead of requiring urgency. Habits that are small enough to coexist with ease are more resilient. They don't rely on discomfort as fuel. They survive calm periods because they don't feel like disruptions. It also helps to create gentle signals that keep attention on the habit without creating pressure. Reminders, minimal check-ins, or simple rituals can prevent drift. These signals don't fight comfort, they coexist with it. Understanding the comfort trap also reframes lapses. When consistency fades during stable periods, it's not because you stopped caring. It's because the system succeeded at its primary job, maintaining equilibrium. Growth requires intentional disturbance of that equilibrium, but only in amounts the system can tolerate. Once this becomes clear, it's easier to see why starting a habit often feels exciting, but continuing it feels dull and heavy. The initial phase disrupts comfort. The later phase competes with it. That transition point is where many habits quietly die, not from failure, but from settling. Recognizing this doesn't magically solve consistency, but it removes another layer of confusion. You stop asking why you lose discipline when things are going well. You start asking how to design habits that survive comfort instead of being erased by it. And once you begin asking that question, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The excitement of starting something new and the difficulty of continuing it are not opposites. They are part of the same process. Understanding why beginnings feel so alive and continuation feels so flat reveals another major reason consistency collapses, one that shows up every time novelty wears off and repetition takes its place. Starting something new almost always feels easier than continuing it, even when the thing itself is objectively harder later on. This pattern is so common that people rarely question it. They accept it as part of human nature. Beginnings feel fresh, middles feel heavy, endings feel distant or irrelevant. When consistency breaks, it usually happens after the starting phase has passed, and people often blame themselves for losing interest or drive. But the difference between starting and continuing is not about character or commitment. It's about how the brain responds to novelty, prediction, and reward over time. At the start of a new habit, the brain is highly engaged. There is uncertainty, possibility, and a sense of potential change. These elements trigger neural systems that are sensitive to novelty and anticipation. The brain pays attention because something new might matter. That attention creates energy. It sharpens focus. It makes effort feel worthwhile. In this phase, the action itself is secondary. What feels good is the sense of beginning. This is why people can start ambitious routines with surprising ease. They wake up early, plan carefully, and push through discomfort. The excitement of change carries them. They are not yet dealing with repetition. They are dealing with possibility. Possibility is stimulating. It creates a sense of momentum that doesn't depend on results. Continuing is different. Once the habit is no longer new, the brain stops treating it as an open question. It knows what the action involves. It knows the effort required. It knows the reward timeline. That knowledge reduces engagement. Attention drops. The system no longer receives the same anticipatory signal. Without that signal, the behavior has to stand on its own. This transition is where many people get stuck. They interpret the loss of excitement as a sign that something is wrong. They think the habit must not be right for them, or that their motivation has failed. In reality, the brain has simply moved from exploration to exploitation. The exploratory phase is energizing. The exploitative phase is efficient but less stimulating. Another reason starting feels easier is that it doesn't require a history. When you begin, there's no backlog of missed days, no streak to maintain, no self-evaluation. The slate feels clean. There's no pressure to live up to anything yet. That absence of pressure matters. Pressure increases cognitive load. It turns action into performance. Continuing carries memory. Every previous attempt, success, or failure becomes part of the context. If you've stopped before, the brain remembers that. It predicts the likelihood of stopping again. That prediction subtly reduces effort investment. The behavior feels less promising because past evidence suggests it may not last. Starting also allows for optimism bias. At the beginning, people overestimate future energy, time, and consistency. This bias makes plans feel realistic even when they aren't. When continuing requires confronting actual constraints, optimism fades. Reality replaces imagination. That shift can feel disappointing, even if nothing has gone wrong. Another important difference is that starting is goal-oriented, while continuing is process-oriented. At the beginning, the goal is clear. You're moving towards something. That direction provides meaning. As time passes, the goal becomes less immediate. The process becomes the focus. Processes are less emotionally engaging than goals. They are repetitive by nature. This is why people often chase new starts instead of maintaining existing routines. Starting provides a hit of clarity and purpose. Continuing requires patience and tolerance for sameness. The brain prefers clarity over endurance. Starting also benefits from contrast. The change from not doing something to doing it is noticeable. That contrast creates a sense of progress. Continuing lacks that contrast. Progress becomes incremental and harder to detect. Without clear markers of improvement, effort feels less rewarding. Another factor is that starting allows for flexibility. In the early phase, people are experimenting. They forgive themselves for imperfection. They expect adjustment. Continuing often comes with stricter expectations. Once something is established, deviation feels like failure rather than exploration. That shift increases pressure and reduces willingness to engage. There's also a social narrative that reinforces this pattern. Beginnings are celebrated. People announce new projects, new habits, new phases. There's attention and encouragement. Continuation is quiet. No one applauds day 37. Without reinforcement, effort feels invisible. Starting also feels lighter because it's fueled by hope rather than evidence. Hope doesn't require proof. It thrives on imagination. Continuing requires confronting data. How often did you actually do this? How much progress have you made? Data can be discouraging, especially if expectations were unrealistic. Another reason continuation feels harder is that it exposes inefficiencies. At the start, you tolerate awkwardness. Over time, those inefficiencies become annoying. If they aren't addressed, irritation builds. The habit starts to feel clumsy. That irritation becomes resistance. Continuing also forces prioritization. At the beginning, you make room for the habit because it's new and important. Over time, other demands compete. The habit has to earn its place repeatedly. Each time it loses, consistency weakens. There's also the issue of diminishing returns. Early effort often produces noticeable gains. Later effort produces smaller ones. The brain notices this shift. The cost feels the same. The reward feels smaller. Without reframing, the effort to reward ratio starts to feel unfavourable. Another subtle difference is emotional tone. Starting feels proactive. Continuing can feel maintenance-oriented. Maintenance lacks drama. It doesn't feel like growth, even though it is. The brain often undervalues maintenance because it doesn't signal change. This undervaluing is dangerous. Most meaningful outcomes depend more on maintenance than on beginnings. Health, skill, and stability all require sustained effort. But because maintenance feels flat, people abandon it in favour of starting something new, repeating the same cycle. There's also the way continuation interacts with self-identity. Starting allows you to try on a new identity without fully committing to it. Continuing requires integration. That integration can feel restrictive. It reduces flexibility. Some people resist that constraint even when the identity is positive. Another overlooked issue is that continuing reveals whether the habit actually fits your life. At the start, you can bend life around the habit. Over time, life pushes back. If the habit doesn't adapt, it breaks. The failure isn't in the starting energy, it's in the lack of adjustment during continuation. Many people also confuse boredom with misalignment. When the excitement fades, they assume the habit is wrong. In reality, boredom is a normal response to repetition. It doesn't mean the behaviour lacks value. It means the brain has categorized it as familiar. The problem is that familiarity reduces dopamine response. Dopamine spikes during anticipation and novelty, not during repetition. This neurochemical shift makes continuation feel less motivating, even if the habit is beneficial. Expecting continuation to feel like starting is a mismatch of biology. This mismatch leads to a common mistake. People keep restarting instead of continuing. Each restart provides a brief sense of control and energy. Each continuation feels harder. Over time, this creates a pattern of serial beginnings with no durable middle. Starting also allows you to avoid confronting sustainability. You don't have to ask whether this can fit into your life long term. Continuing forces that question. If the answer is unclear or uncomfortable, avoidance follows. Another difference is that starting often involves external structure. New programs, schedules, or challenges provide guidance. Once that structure ends, continuation depends on self-generated systems. Many habits die at this transition point. Continuing also requires tolerance for imperfection. You have to keep going even when execution is sloppy or incomplete. Starting is clean. Continuing is messy. People who equate discipline with perfection struggle here. They would rather stop than continue imperfectly. This is why consistency improves when continuation is redefined. Instead of asking whether you're still excited, the more useful question is whether the behavior is still viable at a reduced level. Viability matters more than intensity. Another important shift is recognizing that starting is a moment, while continuing is a condition. Moments are easier to generate than conditions. Conditions require alignment across time. That alignment doesn't happen automatically, it has to be built. When continuation is supported by stable cues, reduced friction, and flexible expectations, it stops feeling like a letdown after the excitement fades. It becomes a background process rather than a daily decision. Understanding the difference between starting and continuing removes another layer of confusion. You stop interpreting the loss of excitement as failure. You stop chasing new beginnings as a solution. You start focusing on how to make repetition tolerable, not thrilling. This shift also clarifies why advice that emphasizes motivation and enthusiasm is incomplete. Enthusiasm is for beginnings. Consistency depends on what happens after enthusiasm leaves. Once that becomes clear, another factor begins to stand out. Even when a habit is well designed, identity aligned, emotionally tolerable, and scaled appropriately, it can still fail for a simple reason that has nothing to do with internal effort at all. The physical and social environment quietly pushes behavior in certain directions, often overpowering intention without ever drawing attention to itself. Most people think of consistency as something that happens inside their head. They focus on mindset, discipline, motivation, or resolve. When a habit fails, the instinct is to look inward and ask what went wrong internally. But behavior is rarely governed by internal factors alone. In many cases, consistency fails not because of lack of effort or understanding, but because the environment quietly shapes behavior in ways that overpower intention without ever feeling forceful. This kind of failure is subtle. It doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like life. Environment doesn't just mean physical space, although this matters. It includes timing, access, defaults, social expectations, noise, convenience, friction, and interruption. These elements work together continuously, nudging behavior in predictable directions. The brain responds to these cues automatically, long before conscious decision-making gets involved. When a habit is misaligned with its environment, it doesn't fail loudly, it fades. One reason an environment is so powerful is that it determines what behaviors are easiest. The brain is constantly selecting the path of least resistance. This isn't laziness, it's efficiency. When two actions are available, the one that requires less effort, fewer steps, and less decision-making will usually win, especially when energy is low. Over time, these small selections accumulate into patterns. This is why people can fully understand what they want to do and still consistently fail to do it. Knowledge doesn't override friction. Intention doesn't eliminate inconvenience. If a habit requires swimming against environmental currents every day, it will eventually lose, no matter how strong the intention was at the beginning. Environment also determines what you notice. Attention is limited. The brain prioritizes what's visible, salient, and immediately relevant. If cues for a habit are subtle or hidden, the behavior won't trigger automatically. If cues for distraction are loud and frequent, they will dominate. This happens without conscious choice. The brain responds to what's in front of it. Many habits fail because their cues are weak. They rely on memory instead of environment. Remembering to do something requires cognitive effort. Being prompted by context does not. When a habit depends on remembering, it competes with everything else demanding attention. It's no surprise that it often loses. Another overlooked aspect of environment is interruption. Modern environments are built around interruption. Notifications, messages, noise, and unexpected demands fragment attention throughout the day. Each interruption resets focus. Restarting focus requires energy. Habits that need sustained attention suffer in these conditions. People blame themselves for being distracted, but the environment is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Environment also shapes emotional tone. Certain spaces are associated with certain behaviors and moods. A bedroom may cue rest. A couch may cue disengagement. A workspace may cue productivity. When habits are placed in environments that cue opposing states, resistance increases. This resistance doesn't feel like refusal. It feels like discomfort or lack of fit. This is why trying to perform focused work in a space associated with relaxation often fails. The environment sends mixed signals. The brain doesn't argue. It follows the stronger association. Over time, repeated failure reinforces the idea that the habit itself is difficult, when the real issue is contextual mismatch. Access is another critical factor. The easier something is to access, the more likely it is to happen. This applies to both helpful and unhelpful behaviors. When distractions are always within reach, and the habit requires preparation, the habit is at a disadvantage. Each extra step reduces follow-through. This reduction is predictable and measurable. People often underestimate how much access shapes behavior. They think they're making choices when they're really responding to availability. This is why changing the environment often produces more reliable change than trying to change behavior directly. When access changes, behavior follows with surprisingly little resistance. Environment also establishes defaults. Defaults are what happens when no active decision is made. Most behavior follows defaults. When the default supports a habit, consistency improves effortlessly. When the default opposes it, consistency requires constant intervention. Constant intervention is unsustainable. This is why habits that require opting in every day are fragile. Habits that happen by default are durable. The brain prefers not to decide. Decision-making is effortful. Environments that reduce decisions reduce friction. Social environment matters just as much. Humans are social organisms. Behavior is influenced by what others expect, model, and reinforce. When a habit is socially supported, consistency feels natural. When it's socially invisible or subtly discouraged, consistency requires more effort. This influence doesn't have to be explicit. Even the absence of support can matter. When no one else values the behavior, it can feel less legitimate. That feeling reduces priority, especially during busy periods. The brain is sensitive to social cues because they historically signaled survival relevance. Another environmental factor is timing. Some habits fail simply because they're placed at the wrong time of day. Energy, attention, and tolerance vary across the day. When a habit is scheduled during a low-capacity window, it will require more effort than necessary. Over time, that extra cost accumulates into resistance. People often choose timing based on availability rather than capacity. They do things when they have time, not when they have energy. This mismatch quietly undermines consistency. The habit feels harder than it needs to be, even though nothing about the habit itself is wrong. Environment also includes the emotional climate of daily life. Chronic stress, unpredictability, and overload reduce the brain's willingness to invest in optional behaviors. In such environments, survival and coping take precedence. Consistency becomes a luxury rather than a baseline. Without acknowledging this, people blame themselves for something that is largely situational. Another subtle environmental issue is how progress is tracked or not tracked. Feedback is part of the environment. When feedback is absent, the brain struggles to evaluate whether effort matters. When feedback is overwhelming or judgmental, it creates pressure. Both extremes can undermine consistency. Many habits exist in environments with no feedback at all. You do the behavior, and nothing obvious happens. Without reinforcement, the brain doesn't register value. Over time, effort feels disconnected from outcome. This disconnect weakens commitment. The physical layout of space also matters. Small design choices influence behavior more than people expect. Where things are placed, what's visible, what requires movement, and what can be reached without standing up all affect decision-making. These factors operate continuously and silently. This is why people often succeed temporarily when they change environments. New jobs, new homes, new schedules disrupt old patterns. The brain becomes more flexible during these transitions. Habits can be inserted more easily. When the environment stabilizes again, behavior reverts to whatever the new default becomes. Environmental stability is a double-edged sword. It reduces stress but reinforces patterns. If the pattern doesn't support the habit will slowly disappear. This isn't sabotage. It's consistency at the environmental level overriding intention at the individual level. Another reason environment causes silent failure is that it distributes responsibility. When behavior is shaped by many small cues, there's no single point of failure. This makes it hard to diagnose the problem. People look for a reason and don't see one. Everything seems fine, and yet the habit is gone. This leads to self-blame. When the cause isn't obvious, people assume it must be internal. They don't realize that dozens of small environmental pressures have been pushing behavior in a different direction the entire time. Environment also influences how effort is perceived. In supportive environments, effort feels purposeful. In hostile or chaotic environments, the same effort feels draining. This perception matters. It affects whether the brain is willing to repeat the behavior. Another issue is that environments change gradually. New responsibilities, new routines, new distractions accumulate. Habits that once fit no longer do. Because the change is slow, people don't adjust the habit. They keep expecting it to work as before. When it doesn't, they interpret that as failure rather than mismatch. This is why habits need periodic redesign. What worked in one environment may not work in another. Consistency requires adaptation. Static routines in dynamic environments are fragile. There's also the problem of competing environments. Work environments, home environments, social environments all impose different norms. A habit that fits one may conflict with another. Without intentional boundaries, the strongest environment wins. The strongest environment is usually the one that's most immediate, most comfortable, or most demanding. Habits that rely on quiet intention are easily drowned out. Another overlooked factor is environmental permission. Some environments implicitly permit certain behaviors and discourage others. Working late may be normalized. Resting may not be. Creative work may be tolerated only after practical tasks are done. These signals shape priority without explicit rules. People often internalize these signals without realizing it. They feel guilty doing certain habits in certain contexts. That guilt increases emotional cost and reduces consistency. Environment also affects recovery. When a habit is disrupted, the environment determines how easy it is to resume. If re-entry requires significant setup, the barrier feels high. If re-entry is simple, recovery happens quickly. Most habits fail not because they stop, but because restarting feels too expensive. This is why minimizing restart cost is crucial. Environments that support easy resumption are more forgiving. Environments that require full recommitment punish small lapses. Another way environment causes silent failure is by shaping expectations. If an environment rewards busyness, slowing down feels wrong. If it rewards productivity, rest feels undeserved. Habits that contradict these values struggle, even if they're beneficial. People often assume they're choosing not to do something, when in reality they're complying with environmental norms. The pressure is subtle, but persistent. Understanding the role of environment shifts the focus from self-control to design. Instead of asking why you can't stick to something, the more useful question becomes what the environment is quietly encouraging instead. That question often reveals that inconsistency isn't random at all. It's the predictable result of cues, defaults, and friction working exactly as intended. Once environment is taken seriously, consistency stops feeling like a personal test and starts looking like an engineering problem. What needs to be closer? What needs to be quieter? What needs to be automatic? What needs to be removed? This perspective also explains why advice that ignores environment is so unreliable. It asks individuals to fight systems that were built to shape behaviour at scale. That fight is exhausting and unnecessary. When the environment supports a habit, discipline becomes almost invisible. When it doesn't, discipline is constantly demanded. That demand is what people experience as inconsistency. As this understanding settles, another pattern becomes clearer. Even when environment is supportive, identity is aligned, effort is scaled, and emotion is managed, consistency can still collapse in a way that looks like laziness from the outside, but feels like emptiness from the inside. That state has a name, and it's often misunderstood. Burnout is one of the most misunderstood states people experience when trying to stay consistent. It's often described in moral terms, even if subtly. People say they've become lazy, unmotivated, or undisciplined. They assume something in them has weakened. But burnout is not a failure of effort, and it's not a lack of care. It's a physiological and psychological response to prolonged demand without sufficient recovery, and it often appears precisely in people who have been trying the hardest for the longest. What makes burnout so confusing is that it doesn't announce itself clearly. It doesn't feel like exhaustion in the way people expect. You don't always feel tired in a way that sleep fixes. You don't necessarily feel sad or distressed. Often what you feel is flat. Tasks that once mattered now feel strangely heavy or pointless. Starting anything feels harder than it should. From the outside, this looks like laziness. From the inside, it feels like friction everywhere. Burnout develops gradually. It's not caused by a single intense period of work or effort. It emerges when demands consistently exceed recovery capacity. That imbalance doesn't have to be extreme to be damaging. Even moderate effort, when sustained without enough rest, emotional relief, or variation, can push the system into a depleted state. The key factor is duration, not intensity. One reason burnout is so often misinterpreted is that people associate it only with work overload. They imagine long hours, high pressure, and obvious stress. But burnout can occur in any domain where effort is required without adequate restoration. This includes self-improvement, habit building, caregiving, emotional labour, and even attempts to get life together. When consistency depends on constant self-regulation, burnout becomes a real risk. The brain does not distinguish between productive effort and effort that feels virtuous. If you're constantly pushing yourself, overriding resistance, managing emotions, and holding yourself to standards, the regulatory systems involved are working continuously. Over time, those systems become less responsive. This isn't collapse, it's down-regulation. Down-regulation is a protective response. When the brain detects that effort is not being balanced by recovery, it reduces output. Motivation drops, interest fades, initiative declines. These changes are not random. They are the system enforcing rest when rest hasn't been taken voluntarily. This is why burnout often feels like loss of motivation. People say they just don't care anymore, but caring hasn't disappeared. The ability to mobilize effort has been temporarily restricted. The brain has learned that effort leads to depletion, so it resists initiating it. That resistance feels like apathy. Burnout also affects reward processing. Activities that once felt satisfying stop producing the same response. This isn't because the activities lost value. It's because the reward system has been overstimulated or under-recovered. When reward sensitivity drops, effort feels unrewarding. Without reward, consistency becomes unsustainable. Another reason burnout looks like laziness is that behaviour slows down selectively. People may still do things that provide immediate comfort or require minimal effort, while avoiding tasks that demand sustained engagement. This selective withdrawal is often judged harshly, but from a biological perspective it makes sense. The system is conserving energy by prioritizing low-cost regulation. Burnout also reduces tolerance for friction. Small obstacles feel bigger. Minor inconveniences become deal breakers. This isn't entitlement. It's a sign that capacity is low. When capacity is low, the margin for effort shrinks. Habits that once felt manageable suddenly feel overwhelming. Emotionally, burnout often presents as irritability, numbness, or detachment rather than sadness. People may feel disconnected from goals they once cared about. This detachment is not a loss of values. It's emotional self-protection. Staying engaged would require energy the system no longer wants to spend. Another hallmark of burnout is cognitive fog. Decision-making becomes harder. Planning feels exhausting. Remembering routines takes more effort. This further undermines consistency. People blame themselves for not being organized or focused, not realizing that their cognitive resources are depleted. Burnout also distorts self-perception. When effort stops producing results, people assume they're the problem. They don't recognize the signs of overload because they've been conditioned to see rest as indulgence and persistence as virtue. This mindset delays recovery and deepens burnout. One of the most damaging aspects of burnout is that it often follows periods of apparent discipline. People look back and say, "I was doing so well and then I just stopped." That sudden stop feels like betrayal of self. In reality, the system was compensating for a long time before it enforced a shutdown. The warning signs were subtle and easy to ignore. Burnout is also cumulative. Each cycle of overextension followed by collapse makes the system more sensitive. Recovery takes longer. Resistance appears sooner. This is why repeated attempts at intense consistency often get shorter over time. People interpret this as declining discipline. It's actually declining tolerance for unsustainable effort. Another reason burnout is misread as laziness is cultural. Many environments reward visible effort and punish rest. When someone slows down, the assumption is that they've stopped trying. There's little language for saying, "My system is overloaded and needs recalibration." Without that language, people default to self-criticism. Burnout also interacts with identity. People who see themselves as hardworking or disciplined experience burnout as a threat to self-concept. Admitting burnout feels like admitting weakness, so they push harder, which worsens the problem. Eventually, the system forces disengagement anyway. It's important to understand that burnout doesn't mean you should stop caring or abandon your goals. It means the way effort has been applied is incompatible with long-term functioning. Recovery is not quitting, it's restoring balance. Recovery from burnout is not just about rest, it's about reducing unnecessary effort. It's about removing constant self-monitoring, easing standards and reintroducing flexibility. It's about allowing inconsistency without judgment so the system can reset. Burnout also reveals which habits are truly supported and which rely entirely on force. When energy is low, only the habits with low friction and strong environmental support remain. This is diagnostic. It shows what the system can sustain. Another important point is that burnout can exist without obvious stressors. People sometimes say, "I don't know why I'm burned out, my life isn't that hard," but internal demands count. Chronic self-improvement, constant optimization, and ongoing self-evaluation are taxing. Even when life looks manageable from the outside, the internal workload may be high. Burnout also reduces creativity and curiosity. Everything feels like obligation. This makes it especially dangerous for habits tied to learning or creative work. When those habits become sources of pressure, they collapse quickly under burnout. Understanding burnout changes how inconsistency is interpreted. Instead of asking why you became lazy, the more accurate question is what you've been carrying without adequate recovery. That question often reveals a pattern of overcommitment, unrealistic standards, or constant self-regulation. This perspective also changes how consistency should be rebuilt. The answer is not to push harder, it's to lower the cost of engagement. Smaller actions, fewer decisions, less pressure. Consistency after burnout looks different from consistency before burnout. It has to. Burnout also explains why advice that emphasizes hustle, grit, or relentless discipline is so harmful to some people. It ignores recovery. It treats depletion as weakness. For people already near their limit, that advice accelerates collapse. Recognizing burnout for what it is creates relief. The struggle makes sense. The resistance has a reason. That relief is not an excuse. It's the beginning of redesign. When effort is reintroduced gradually with respect for limits, consistency can return without triggering shutdown. But it returns in a quieter form. Less dramatic, less intense, more sustainable. This understanding also makes it easier to see why people often confuse burnout with loss of interest. They say they don't want the goal anymore. Sometimes that's true. Often it's just that the cost of pursuing it has become too high in its current form. Once burnout is understood as a state rather than a flaw, the path forward becomes clearer. The focus shifts from forcing productivity to rebuilding capacity. That shift is uncomfortable in a culture that equates worth with output, but it's necessary. And as capacity begins to return, another challenge becomes obvious. Even with rest, even with reduced effort, consistency still struggles against a powerful bias built deep into the brain, a bias that favors what feels good now over what matters later. That bias quietly shapes behavior every day, and understanding it is essential for any attempt at long-term consistency. The brain is not designed to value the future in the way modern goals require it to. This isn't a flaw. It's a consequence of how decision-making systems evolved under conditions where survival depended on responding to what was immediately available. Food now mattered more than food later. Safety now mattered more than safety tomorrow. That bias toward the present still shapes behavior, even though the environment has changed. When consistency breaks down, this bias is often doing the quiet work behind the scenes. Immediate rewards feel real, they're concrete, they arrive quickly and provide feedback the brain understands. Delayed rewards are abstract. They exist as ideas, projections, or promises. The brain can reason about them, but it doesn't feel them in the same way. This difference matters. Behavior is guided more by felt value than by logical value. When the felt value of an action is low, consistency becomes difficult to maintain. This is why habits with immediate payoff are easier to sustain. Checking messages, eating, resting, scrolling, or watching something engaging all provide instant feedback. The brain registers relief, pleasure, or distraction right away. That reinforcement strengthens the behavior. Habits tied to long-term outcomes rarely provide that kind of immediate signal. Exercising today doesn't make you feel healthy in a way that's obvious. Studying today doesn't make you feel skilled. Saving money today doesn't feel like security. The reward exists, but it's delayed and diffuse. The brain handles this mismatch through a process called temporal discounting. Future rewards are mentally discounted compared to present ones. The further away the reward is, the less weight it carries in decision-making. This isn't a conscious choice. It's an automatic bias. Even when people intellectually understand the long-term benefit, their behavior is still guided by what feels valuable now. This bias becomes stronger under certain conditions. Fatigue increases discounting. Stress increases it. Emotional strain increases it. When energy is low, the brain becomes even more focused on immediate regulation. Long-term goals lose priority not because they stop mattering, but because the system is trying to stabilize itself. This explains why consistency often breaks at the end of the day. After hours of decisions, emotional management, and effort, the brain wants relief. Immediate rewards promise that relief. Long-term effort does not. Choosing the immediate option feels rational in that state, even if it contradicts earlier intentions. Another reason immediate rewards dominate is that they reduce uncertainty. You know what you're getting. The outcome is predictable. Long-term rewards are uncertain. You might exercise for months and still feel dissatisfied. You might work consistently and still not reach the goal you imagined. The brain doesn't like uncertainty. It prefers guaranteed outcomes, even if they're smaller. This preference is amplified by past experience. If someone has invested long-term effort before without seeing the expected result, their brain becomes more skeptical. The predicted value of delayed rewards drops further. Consistency becomes harder not because of pessimism, but because the system has learned that delay doesn't always pay off. Immediate rewards also interrupt discomfort. Effort often comes with some level of discomfort, whether physical, mental, or emotional. Immediate rewards offer escape. That escape is reinforcing. Over time, the brain learns to associate effort with discomfort and immediate reward with relief. This association strengthens avoidance of effortful habits. This is why people often turn to immediate rewards after attempting to be consistent. The reward becomes a way to recover, but that recovery is shallow. It doesn't restore capacity. It just numbs discomfort temporarily. Over time, the habit of seeking immediate relief becomes stronger than the habit of long-term effort. Another important point is that immediate rewards often masquerade as rest. Scrolling or passive entertainment feels like recovery, but it doesn't always replenish energy in a meaningful way. The brain receives stimulation, not restoration. This can leave people feeling more depleted, increasing reliance on immediate rewards the next time effort is required. The brain's reward system also adapts quickly. What felt rewarding yesterday feels normal today. This adaptation creates escalation. More stimulation is needed to achieve the same effect. Meanwhile, long-term rewards remain distant and unchanged. The gap between immediate and delayed reward grows wider. This creates a reinforcing loop. Immediate rewards become more compelling. Long-term effort feels less worthwhile. Consistency erodes quietly, without a dramatic decision to quit. Another issue is that immediate rewards often align with the environment. They're built into devices, schedules, and social norms. Long-term habits often require carving out space. That imbalance gives immediate rewards an advantage. They don't need planning. They're always available. The brain also learns sequences. If effort is consistently followed by an immediate reward, the reward becomes part of the habit loop. This can be helpful if designed intentionally. But when the reward undermines the original goal, the loop becomes counterproductive. For example, using distraction as a reward for effort can train the brain to associate work with escape rather than satisfaction. Immediate rewards also shape expectations. When people get used to instant feedback, patience declines. Waiting feels harder. Consistency requires waiting. That mismatch increases frustration. Frustration increases avoidance. The cycle reinforces itself. Another subtle effect is that immediate rewards narrow focus. They pull attention away from long-term narratives. When attention is repeatedly hijacked by short-term stimuli, it becomes harder to hold long-term goals in mind. Consistency suffers because the goal fades from awareness. This is not a failure of memory, it's competition for attention. Immediate rewards are designed to capture attention. Long-term goals are quiet. Without deliberate support, they lose. The brain's love of immediate rewards also explains why streaks can be motivating initially, but fragile over time. The streak becomes the immediate reward. When it breaks, the reward disappears. Without another source of reinforcement, the habit collapses. The system was being supported by a short-term signal, not the habit itself. Another common mistake is assuming that awareness of this bias will eliminate it. Knowing that the brain prefers immediate rewards does not change that preference. Insight doesn't override biology. Design does. Consistency improves when immediate rewards are aligned with long-term goals rather than competing with them. This alignment doesn't require large rewards. Small, reliable signals are often more effective. A sense of completion, a brief moment of acknowledgement, a physical cue that marks the behavior as done. These signals give the brain something to register now, even if the ultimate benefit comes later. It also helps to reduce the appeal of competing immediate rewards. This doesn't mean eliminating them completely, it means adding friction so they're not the default response to discomfort. When immediate rewards require a bit more effort, long-term habits gain relative strength. Another strategy is to shorten the feedback loop of the habit itself. Breaking goals into smaller units creates more frequent completion signals. Each completion provides a small immediate reward. Over time, these signals accumulate, making consistency more tolerable. The brain also responds to progress, not just outcome. Tracking progress in a simple, non-judgmental way can provide immediate feedback. This feedback doesn't have to be motivational, it just has to exist. Without feedback, effort feels disconnected. Another important point is that immediate rewards are not inherently bad. They become problematic when they are the only form of regulation available. When people lack meaningful rest, social connection, or satisfaction, immediate rewards fill the gap. In that context, long-term effort feels like deprivation. This is why consistency improves when life contains enough genuine reward outside of habits. When emotional needs are met, the brain is less desperate for immediate relief. Long-term effort becomes more viable. The brain's preference for immediate rewards also explains why stress derails consistency so reliably. Stress increases the need for regulation. Immediate rewards provide that regulation. Long-term goals do not. The shift in behavior is logical from the system's perspective. Understanding this bias removes another layer of self-blame. You're not weak for choosing what feels good now. You're responding to a system designed to do exactly that. The problem isn't the preference itself, it's that modern goals rarely account for it. Once this becomes clear, the question changes. Instead of asking how to resist immediate rewards, the more useful question is how to redesign habits so they offer something now without undermining what matters later. That redesign doesn't require discipline in the traditional sense. It requires honesty about what the brain values and why. When immediate rewards are integrated thoughtfully, consistency becomes less of a struggle. This also sets the stage for understanding why consistency tends to break during certain periods of life more than others. When stress rises, when demands accumulate, when the system is stretched thin, the pull of immediate relief becomes stronger. Recognizing that pattern leads directly into the next challenge, which is not about reward at all, but about what happens to discipline when life becomes unpredictable and pressure increases beyond what routines were built to handle. Stressful periods don't usually arrive with a clear warning label. They blend into life quietly. A few more responsibilities, less sleep than usual, background worry that never fully switches off. On the surface, nothing looks dramatically wrong, but consistency starts slipping anyway. Routines that once felt manageable begin to feel intrusive. Habits that were stable for months quietly disappear. From the outside, this looks like loss of discipline at exactly the moment discipline would seem most important. From the inside, it feels like there's simply no room left. The key thing to understand is that stress doesn't just add difficulty on top of life. It reorganizes priorities at a biological level. When the brain detects ongoing stress, it shifts into a mode focused on short-term management. Attention narrows, energy is redirected, flexibility decreases. These changes are not conscious choices. They are automatic adjustments designed to help the system cope with threat, uncertainty, or overload. In this state, consistency becomes expensive, not because the habits themselves changed, but because the brain's operating mode did. Long-term routines depend on spare capacity. They assume that there is enough energy left over after immediate demands are met. Stress reduces that surplus. What used to fit into the margins no longer does. One of the most important effects of stress is how it consumes cognitive bandwidth. Stress is not just an emotion, it's a state of heightened monitoring. The brain stays alert, scanning for problems, replaying concerns, and preparing for possible outcomes. This constant background activity uses the same resources needed for planning, self-regulation, and habit maintenance. Even when stress is mild, if it's persistent, the drain adds up. This is why people often say they feel busy even when they aren't doing more. Their mind is occupied. That occupation leaves less room for optional behaviours. Consistency fails not because people stop caring, but because their attention is already allocated elsewhere. Stress also alters time perception. When under pressure, the future feels compressed. Everything becomes about getting through the next few hours or days. Long-term goals lose psychological distance. They feel irrelevant to the immediate situation. This doesn't mean people abandon those goals intellectually. It means the brain temporarily deprioritizes them. This shift is protective. In uncertain conditions, focusing on distant outcomes can be dangerous. The system prioritizes flexibility and responsiveness. Unfortunately, consistency depends on the opposite. It depends on repeating the same behavior regardless of fluctuation. Stress and consistency are working at cross purposes. Another critical factor is emotional regulation. Stress increases emotional volatility. Small frustrations feel bigger. Patience decreases. Tolerance for discomfort drops. Habits that require effort or delayed reward become harder to justify emotionally. The brain favours actions that reduce tension quickly. This is why stress increases reliance on immediate rewards. Comfort behaviours aren't signs of weakness, they're attempts at regulation. When stress is high, regulation becomes a priority. Long-term effort does not regulate emotion in the moment. It often increases discomfort before it reduces it. That makes it a poor choice from the brain's perspective. Stress also increases decision fatigue. Each stressor adds decisions, whether obvious or subtle, how to respond, what to worry about, what to postpone. Over time, this exhausts regulatory capacity. Habits that require active choice suffer first. Automatic behaviours remain, optional routines disappear. This explains why consistency often survives in areas with strong external structure during stress, like work obligations, but collapses in personal routines. External structure reduces decision-making. Internal routines increase it. Under stress, the brain favours fewer decisions. There's also the issue of unpredictability. Stressful periods are often unpredictable. Schedules shift. Interruptions increase. Plans change. Consistency relies on predictability. When predictability disappears, routines become harder to execute. Each deviation requires adjustment. Adjustment costs energy. People often respond to this by trying to hold routines rigidly, which increases stress further. When routines break anyway, the failure feels personal. In reality, the routine was incompatible with the conditions. Stress also affects memory. Under prolonged stress, working memory capacity decreases. Remembering intentions becomes harder. This is why people forget habits they've been doing for months. The forgetting isn't intentional. The cue never makes it into awareness. This leads to a dangerous loop. The habit doesn't happen. The person notices later. Self-criticism follows. That criticism increases stress. Increased stress further reduces capacity. Consistency erodes faster. Another way stress undermines consistency is through sleep disruption. Stress interferes with sleep quality even when total sleep time seems adequate. Poor sleep reduces executive function, emotional regulation and energy. The next day feels harder. Habits that require effort are postponed. Over time, this compounds. Stress also narrows identity. During difficult periods, people define themselves by survival roles: worker, caregiver, problem solver. Other parts of identity fade temporarily. Habits tied to those other identities lose relevance. This doesn't mean they're abandoned permanently, they're deprioritized. This is why people often return to habits after stressful periods end. The capacity returns. Identity expands again. The behavior wasn't rejected, it was suspended. Another overlooked factor is that stress increases sensitivity to failure. When already under pressure, small setbacks feel heavier. Missing a habit doesn't feel neutral. It feels like confirmation that things are out of control. To avoid that feeling, people avoid restarting. Avoidance reduces exposure to disappointment, at least temporarily. This avoidance is not conscious. It's emotional self-protection. Unfortunately, it also delays recovery. Stress also interferes with reward processing. Chronic stress reduces the brain's responsiveness to positive feedback. Effort feels less rewarding. Progress feels muted. Without reward, repetition becomes difficult. Consistency relies on reinforcement, even subtle reinforcement. Stress blunts it. Another reason consistency breaks during stress is competing priorities that feel morally charged. During stressful times, people often feel they should focus on what's urgent or necessary. Personal routines can feel selfish or trivial by comparison. This creates guilt around maintaining habits, which increases emotional cost. That guilt can be especially strong for habits related to self-care. Rest, exercise, or creative time may feel inappropriate when other demands are pressing. The habit isn't just effortful, it feels wrong. That moral conflict makes consistency unsustainable. Stress also changes how people evaluate effort. During calm periods, effort is seen as investment. During stress, effort is seen as burden. The same action is interpreted differently depending on context. That interpretation matters more than the action itself. Another subtle effect is that stress reduces future orientation. Planning feels pointless when outcomes feel uncertain. People say they'll return to routines once things settle down. That settlement often takes longer than expected. In the meantime, habits atrophy. There's also the issue of cumulative stress. Even if each stressor is manageable, their accumulation can overwhelm capacity. People often underestimate this accumulation because each stressor seems small on its own. Consistency erodes slowly as capacity is chipped away. This is why people sometimes say they don't know why they stopped. Nothing dramatic happened. The system simply ran out of room. Stress also reduces willingness to tolerate boredom. Boredom is uncomfortable even in calm conditions. Under stress, it's intolerable. Habits that involve repetition without stimulation suffer first. The brain seeks distraction to counteract stress. Repetitive routines lose appeal. Another factor is that stress increases the need for control. When life feels unstable, people try to control what they can. Paradoxically, this can undermine consistency. Habits that don't provide immediate control or relief feel frustrating. People abandon them in favor of actions that offer a sense of agency now. Stress also affects social behavior. During stressful periods, social interaction may increase or decrease depending on the situation. Both changes can disrupt routines. Social obligations take time. Social withdrawal removes accountability. Either way, consistency is affected. It's also important to note that stressful periods often last longer than expected. People tell themselves they'll get back on track next week, next month, once things calm down. When calm doesn't arrive, they interpret the delay as failure rather than as adaptation to prolonged stress. This misinterpretation leads to unrealistic expectations. People try to resume full routines before capacity is returned. The attempt fails, discouragement follows, the habit is abandoned again, the cycle repeats. Understanding this pattern changes how consistency should be handled during stress. The goal is not to maintain routines at all costs. The goal is to preserve continuity at a reduced level. Smaller actions, fewer demands, lower standards. Consistency during stress should look different. It should be lighter, quieter, and more flexible. Expecting normal performance under abnormal conditions guarantees disappointment. Another important shift is to separate consistency from productivity. During stress, consistency might mean staying connected to the habit in some minimal way, not making progress. Connection matters more than output. Stress also requires compassion in interpretation. Losing consistency during difficult periods is not a personal failing. It's a sign that capacity was exceeded. That information can be used to redesign routines for resilience. This also means planning for stress in advance. Habits that only work when life is calm are fragile. Habits that include a low-energy version are resilient. The low-energy version keeps the identity alive even when effort is minimal. Understanding why consistency breaks during stress removes a major source of shame. It explains why disciplined people struggle during hard times, and why pushing harder often makes things worse. Once this is understood, the question shifts again. If stress, emotion, environment, identity, and reward all shape consistency, then discipline can no longer be treated as a moral quality. It starts to look more like a skill shaped by biology and context. That realization leads directly into the next idea, which reframes discipline itself in a way that makes long-term consistency more achievable. Discipline is usually talked about as if it reveals something about who a person is. Someone who stays consistent is seen as strong, responsible, or virtuous. Someone who struggles is seen as careless, weak, or lacking commitment. These judgments are often subtle, but they shape how people think about themselves and others. Over time, they create a moral narrative around behavior. Discipline becomes a measure of worth rather than a function of how a system operates. This framing is not just inaccurate, it actively interferes with the ability to become more consistent. When discipline is treated as a moral trait, failure feels personal. It doesn't feel like a mismatch between behavior and conditions. It feels like evidence that something is wrong with you. That interpretation changes how the brain responds. Instead of looking for adjustments, it triggers defensiveness, shame, or avoidance. None of those states support learning or redesign. They consume energy and narrow attention. A more accurate way to understand discipline is as a biological skill. Skills are not fixed traits. They vary by context. They improve with practice under supportive conditions. They degrade under stress or fatigue. No one assumes that struggling with a physical skill under poor conditions says something about moral character. But when it comes to discipline, people make that assumption constantly. Biological skills depend on systems. They rely on coordination between energy availability, attention, memory, emotional regulation, and environment. Discipline emerges when those systems are aligned. It disappears when they are not. The same person can appear disciplined or undisciplined depending on how these variables interact at a given moment. Seeing discipline as a biological skill immediately explains patterns that moral explanations cannot. It explains why people can be consistent in some areas and not others. It explains why consistency improves in structured environments and collapses in chaotic ones. It explains why discipline fluctuates across the day, the week, and different phases of life. None of this variability makes sense if discipline is a character trait. It makes perfect sense if discipline is an outcome of system capacity. Another important aspect of skills is that they are learned implicitly, not just through intention. You don't become good at a skill by wanting it. You become good by repeatedly engaging under conditions that allow the system to adapt. Discipline works the same way. You don't become disciplined by deciding to be disciplined. You become disciplined by repeatedly acting within structures that make consistency possible. This also means discipline has limits. Skills have fatigue thresholds. They degrade when overused without recovery. They require maintenance. They improve slowly and unevenly. Expecting discipline to operate flawlessly across all conditions is like expecting fine motor control when you're exhausted or injured. The expectation itself is unrealistic. The moral framing of discipline ignores these limits. It assumes that effort is always available and that failure reflects insufficient trying. This belief encourages people to push past capacity instead of respecting it. In the short term, that can produce results. In the long term, it produces burnout, resentment, and collapse. When discipline is understood biologically, effort is no longer the default solution. Design becomes the focus. How is energy conserved? How are decisions minimized? How are cues stabilized? How is recovery built in? These questions lead to sustainable consistency because they work with the system rather than against it. Another advantage of this framing is that it removes unnecessary comparison. Moral traits invite ranking. Who is more disciplined? Who deserves praise? Biological skills are personal. They depend on individual constraints and environments. Comparison becomes less relevant because the variables are different. This reduces pressure and makes experimentation safer. Discipline as a biological skill also explains why consistency often improves with age or experience, even without increased motivation. People learn, often unconsciously, how to manage their energy, structure their time, and avoid unnecessary friction. They stop relying on force and start relying on systems. What looks like maturity or character growth is often just better design. This perspective also reframes failure. When a skill breaks down, the response is not self-judgment, but diagnosis. What changed? Was there less sleep? More stress? A shift in environment? A loss of structure? This diagnostic approach leads to adjustment instead of abandonment. Another important implication is that discipline can be trained indirectly. You don't train it by practicing resistance. You train it by practicing setup, by arranging your environment so the desired action is easier than the alternative, by aligning habits with existing routines, by reducing the number of decisions required. Each successful repetition under low strain strengthens the system's ability to repeat the behavior again. This is very different from training discipline through deprivation or intensity. High-effort approaches create the illusion of strength, but they don't produce stability. Stability comes from repeatability under ordinary conditions. Seeing discipline as biological also clarifies why shame is so damaging. Shame increases stress. Stress reduces capacity. Reduced capacity undermines consistency. The very emotion people use to motivate themselves biologically undermines the skill they're trying to develop. This is not a failure of mindset. It's a predictable chain reaction. It also explains why compassion is not indulgence. Compassion reduces threat. Reduced threat restores capacity. Restored capacity makes consistency more likely. This doesn't mean lowering all standards. It means lowering unnecessary pressure so the system can function. Another misconception that falls away is the idea that discipline should feel the same for everyone. Because biological systems differ, discipline feels different across people. Some people thrive on routine, others need variation, some need strong external structure, others need autonomy. Treating one model as universally correct guarantees frustration for those it doesn't fit. This biological framing also changes how discipline should be taught. Instead of emphasizing grit or toughness, it emphasizes observation and adjustment. What drains energy? What restores it? What times of day support effort? What environments reduce friction? These are learnable skills. They improve with attention, not judgment. It also highlights the role of health. Sleep, nutrition, movement, and stress management are not optional extras. They directly affect the systems that make discipline possible. Ignoring these factors while demanding consistency is like demanding performance from a machine without maintenance. Another important point is that biological skills are context-dependent, but not fragile if designed well. They can be resilient if they include flexibility. Discipline doesn't have to mean doing the same thing every day. It means maintaining engagement across changing conditions. That flexibility is a feature, not a weakness. This reframing also explains why many people experience a breakthrough when they stop trying so hard. When effort is reduced and structure is improved, the system relaxes. Resistance decreases. Behavior becomes more consistent, not because of increased moral strength, but because the cost has dropped below the system's tolerance threshold. Understanding discipline this way also removes the false divide between discipline and self-care. They are not opposites. Self-care maintains the system that discipline depends on. Neglecting recovery in the name of discipline undermines discipline biologically. It also clarifies why some people appear disciplined without trying. Their environments, routines, and roles support consistency automatically. What looks like personal virtue is often structural advantage. Recognizing this doesn't diminish their effort. It makes the playing field more visible. When discipline is no longer moralized, asking for help becomes easier. Adjusting routines feels sensible rather than like cheating. Reducing goals feels strategic rather than like giving up. These shifts increase long-term success. This perspective also helps explain why discipline can disappear during certain life phases and return later. Capacity changes. Conditions change. The skill goes offline temporarily and then comes back when support returns. This is not failure, it's adaptation. Another important consequence is patience. Skills develop slowly, they don't change overnight. Expecting immediate transformation leads to overreach and disappointment. Expecting gradual improvement allows for learning. This also means discipline should be built with margins. Margins absorb variability. They allow for bad days without collapse. Moral discipline allows no margin. Biological discipline requires it. When you stop seeing discipline as proof of worth, the pressure lifts. That pressure was consuming energy. With less pressure, more capacity becomes available. Consistency improves quietly. This doesn't mean discipline becomes effortless. Effort is still involved, but the effort is targeted. It's used to set up systems, not to fight yourself daily. That difference matters. As this reframing settles in, the final shift becomes possible. If discipline is a biological skill shaped by conditions, then consistency doesn't come from forcing yourself to be better. It comes from understanding what actually makes consistency possible and building around that reality. That understanding leads directly into the final piece of the puzzle. What, in practical terms, allows consistency to emerge and persist without constant struggle? Consistency becomes possible when the problem is no longer framed as a test of character and is instead treated as a question of conditions. Up to this point, everything we've examined points to the same conclusion from different angles. People don't fail to stay consistent because they don't care enough, don't want it badly enough, or don't understand what to do. They fail because the system required to repeat behavior over time is overloaded, unsupported, or poorly designed. Once that is accepted, consistency stops being mysterious. It becomes something that can be built deliberately, not through force, but through alignment. The first thing that actually makes consistency possible is reducing the cost of starting. Most habits fail at the point of initiation, not execution. The behavior itself may not be that difficult, but getting into it is. This is where people often misdirect their effort. They focus on making the habit more impressive or more complete instead of making it easier to begin. Beginning is the bottleneck. Reducing the cost of starting means removing unnecessary steps. Fewer decisions, less setup, less negotiation. When a habit requires preparation, planning, or emotional readiness, it competes poorly with behaviors that require none of those things. Consistency improves when the first action is so small and obvious that it feels almost automatic. This isn't about lowering standards permanently. It's about lowering the barrier to engagement so the system doesn't resist initiation. Another critical factor is stability of cues. The brain relies heavily on association. When a behavior is reliably linked to a specific time, place, or preceding action, the brain begins to anticipate it. That anticipation reduces effort. When cues are inconsistent, the brain has to reevaluate each time. That reevaluation costs energy and invites resistance. This is why habits tied to existing routines are more durable than standalone ones. They borrow stability from what's already there. When consistency depends on remembering or deciding, it remains fragile. When it depends on context, it strengthens. Consistency also becomes possible when expectations are scaled to capacity, not aspiration. Many people design habits for their best days. Those days feel motivating and productive, but they are not representative. The average day, and especially the low-energy day, is where consistency is tested. Habits that only work when energy is high will fail often enough to collapse entirely. Designing for low-capacity days doesn't mean settling for less. It means building a minimum version of the behavior that can survive stress, fatigue, and distraction. This minimum version preserves continuity. It keeps the identity alive. It prevents the psychological cost of restarting from scratch. Over time, this continuity matters more than intensity. Another element that makes consistency possible is minimizing decision fatigue. Every decision carries a cost. When a habit requires deciding when, how, and how much every day, the cumulative cost becomes significant. Consistency improves when decisions are made once and reused. Fixed times, fixed locations, predefined scopes. These constraints reduce cognitive load, making repetition easier. This is why people who appear highly disciplined often rely on routine more than motivation. Their days are structured to limit choice. This isn't rigidity, it's efficiency. The fewer decisions required, the less regulatory effort is needed. Environment plays a central role here. Consistency becomes possible when the environment supports the desired behavior by default, when tools are visible, when distractions are less accessible, when the path of least resistance leads toward the habit instead of away from it. This doesn't require extreme changes. Small adjustments compound over time. Removing friction from helpful behaviors and adding friction to competing ones shifts behavior without relying on willpower. This is not manipulation. It's acknowledgement of how decision-making actually works. People don't consistently choose what's best. They choose what's easiest, especially when tired. Another factor that supports consistency is predictable recovery. Effort without recovery leads to burnout. Consistency without rest is unsustainable. What makes consistency possible is not relentless effort, but a rhythm of engagement and recovery that the system can tolerate. Recovery doesn't only mean sleep or time off, it also means emotional relief. Reduce self-monitoring. Periods where the habit is allowed to be imperfect without penalty. When recovery is built in, the system doesn't need to shut down to protect itself. Consistency also depends on how failure is interpreted. Missed days are inevitable. What matters is whether they lead to resumption or abandonment. Consistency survives when recovery is easy and emotionally neutral. When a miss triggers self-criticism, shame, or all-or-nothing thinking, the cost of restarting increases. Over time, that cost becomes prohibitive. Designing for easy recovery means expecting disruption and planning for it. It means defining what the next step is after a break, instead of treating the break as a reset to zero. Habits that include a re-entry point are far more resilient than those that depend on unbroken streaks. Another critical component is feedback that is informative rather than judgmental. The brain needs signals to understand whether effort matters, but those signals don't need to be dramatic. Simple acknowledgement that the behavior happened is often enough. Overly emotional feedback, whether positive or negative, can increase pressure and undermine consistency. Tracking can help, but only if it remains lightweight. When tracking becomes a performance evaluation, it adds stress. When it remains observational, it supports learning. The goal is awareness, not accountability through fear. Consistency also becomes possible when habits are aligned with identity in a realistic way. This doesn't mean adopting a new identity overnight. It means choosing behaviors that fit who you already are, or who you are becoming gradually. Identity updates through evidence. Small, repeated actions provide that evidence more reliably than grand gestures. When a habit feels like something someone like you would do, resistance drops. When it feels like an act of impersonation, resistance increases. Consistency improves when habits are scaled to feel believable. Social reinforcement also plays a role. Habits that exist entirely in isolation are harder to maintain. This doesn't require public accountability or announcements. It can be as simple as shared expectation, mutual participation, or even silent normalization. When behavior is socially legible, it gains stability. Another factor is meaning at the right scale. Habits don't need to be connected to grand purpose, but they do need to feel relevant to daily life. Abstract future benefits are weak motivators. Immediate relevance is stronger. Consistency improves when the habit solves a small present problem, even if it also supports a larger goal. For example, movement that helps you feel less stiff today is easier to maintain than movement justified only by long-term health. Writing that clarifies today's thoughts is easier than writing justified only by distant success. Immediate usefulness anchors repetition. Consistency is also supported by flexibility in form but stability in intent. Rigid habits break under changing conditions. Flexible habits adapt. This doesn't mean doing something different every day. It means allowing variation in how the behavior is expressed while preserving the core function. This flexibility reduces pressure. It allows the system to stay engaged even when circumstances shift. The habit survives because it's not brittle. Another often overlooked factor is pacing. Many habits fail because they ask for too much change too quickly. Rapid change overwhelms the system. Gradual change allows adaptation. Consistency improves when increases in demand are slow enough for the system to recalibrate. This is not about patience as a virtue. It's about allowing biological systems time to adjust. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition, not intensity. Rushing this process increases resistance. Consistency also depends on honest capacity assessment. This requires paying attention to how habits feel over time, not just whether they are completed. Chronic strain is a warning sign. Ignoring it leads to burnout. Adjusting in response to it preserves continuity. This adjustment can feel like backtracking, but it isn't. It's refinement. Habits that survive refinement are the ones that last. Another thing that makes consistency possible is removing unnecessary moral weight. When habits become tied to self-worth, every deviation feels threatening. That threat increases stress and reduces capacity. Treating habits as tools rather than tests lowers emotional cost and supports repetition. This shift also encourages curiosity instead of judgment. Instead of asking why you failed, you ask what made it harder this time. That question leads to useful information. Consistency also improves when people stop expecting it to feel good. Many beneficial behaviors feel neutral most of the time. Expecting enjoyment sets an unrealistic standard. Expecting tolerability is more accurate. A habit that is tolerable is sustainable. A habit that must be enjoyable often isn't. This doesn't mean ignoring enjoyment altogether. It means not requiring it as a condition for action. Enjoyment may come and go. Consistency survives when it's not dependent on mood. Another factor is aligning habits with energy rhythms. Everyone has natural fluctuations in alertness and focus. Consistency improves when habits are placed where energy is more reliable. Fighting energy rhythms requires constant effort. Working with them reduces cost. This requires observation rather than optimization. Noticing when certain behaviors feel easier provides clues. Those clues are often more reliable than schedules imposed from outside. Consistency also becomes possible when people stop trying to optimize everything at once. Multiple simultaneous changes multiply cognitive load. The system becomes overwhelmed. Focusing on one or two core behaviors allows capacity to concentrate. Once those stabilize, others can be added. This staged approach respects limits. It reduces the chance of burnout and collapse. Another important support is permission to maintain rather than improve. Not every phase of life is for growth. Some phases are for holding steady. Allowing consistency to mean maintenance prevents unnecessary pressure. Maintenance is not stagnation, it's preservation of capacity. Consistency also depends on trust in the process. This trust doesn't come from belief, it comes from experience. When small efforts reliably lead to manageable outcomes, trust grows. When effort leads to exhaustion, trust erodes. Designing habits that build trust is essential. This is why intensity-based approaches fail long-term. They produce impressive short-term results but undermine trust. The system learns that effort equals pain. Avoidance follows. Consistency also improves when people allow habits to be boring. Boredom is not a problem. It's a sign of familiarity. Familiarity reduces cognitive load. Habits that become boring are easier to repeat because they don't demand attention. The desire to constantly optimize or gamify habits often backfires. It keeps the behavior in the foreground. It prevents it from becoming automatic. Letting habits fade into the background is often the goal. Another overlooked support is letting go of perfection. Consistency does not mean doing something well every time. It means staying engaged over time. Sloppy repetitions still count. They reinforce identity and maintain continuity. Perfectionism raises the cost of action and increases avoidance. Consistency also becomes possible when people redefine success. Success is not uninterrupted execution. It's return. Returning after disruption is the real skill. Every successful return strengthens the system's resilience. This perspective reduces fear of failure. When failure is expected and recoverable, effort feels safer. Safety increases engagement. Consistency is also supported by honest reflection without rumination. Brief check-ins to notice what's working and what's not can guide adjustment. Extended self-analysis often increases pressure. Keeping reflection practical and time-limited helps. Another important factor is acceptance of variability. No system performs identically every day. Expecting uniform output ignores reality. Consistency exists across averages, not moments. Accepting this reduces unnecessary frustration. Consistency also depends on removing artificial urgency. When everything feels urgent, nothing is sustainable. Habits that are framed as emergencies burn out quickly. Framing habits as ongoing processes supports longevity. Another subtle support is separating habits from outcomes. Focusing too much on results increases pressure and disappointment. Focusing on the behavior itself allows repetition without constant evaluation. Consistency also becomes possible when people stop comparing their process to others. Comparison distorts expectations. It introduces standards that may not fit individual constraints. Removing comparison allows habits to be designed for the actual person, not an imagined one. All of these factors point in the same direction. Consistency is not something you summon. It's something that emerges when conditions are right. Those conditions can be shaped. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to make repetition possible more often than not. This doesn't produce dramatic transformation. It produces quiet stability, progress that accumulates slowly, identity that shifts gradually, habits that survive stress, boredom and disruption because they are not dependent on constant effort. Understanding what actually makes consistency possible changes how the entire problem is approached. You stop trying to win a daily battle. You start designing a system that doesn't require one. And once that system is in place, something else becomes clear. Discipline no longer feels like something you either have or don't have. It becomes something you live with, something that adjusts with you, something that supports life instead of fighting it. That realization naturally brings the conversation to its final place, not with a sense of completion, but with a shift in relationship to the idea of discipline itself and how it can exist without constant struggle. For most people, the struggle with discipline has never really been about action. It has been about the relationship they have with themselves while trying to act. Fighting discipline usually means fighting your own limits, moods, biology, and circumstances. It means treating resistance as an enemy instead of information. It means interpreting difficulty as failure rather than feedback. Over time, that fight becomes exhausting, and exhaustion is what ultimately breaks consistency, not lack of desire. Living with discipline is a very different posture. It does not begin with control. It begins with cooperation. Cooperation with how energy actually fluctuates. Cooperation with how attention moves. Cooperation with the fact that effort has a cost, and that cost has to be paid somewhere. When discipline is treated as something you live with rather than something you impose, the entire tone of the process changes. Living with discipline means accepting that consistency will never be perfectly smooth. There will always be days when engagement is light and days when it is heavier. There will be interruptions, pauses, and periods where habits shrink instead of expand. None of that means discipline has disappeared. It means the system is adapting. Expecting anything else is expecting a human system to behave like a machine. One of the most important shifts in living with discipline is letting go of the idea that resistance must be eliminated. Resistance is not a malfunction. It is a signal that something in the system is under strain. When you stop fighting resistance and start listening to it, it becomes useful. It tells you when effort is too high, when recovery is insufficient, or when expectations no longer match reality. This doesn't mean giving up whenever something feels hard. It means responding intelligently to difficulty instead of escalating pressure. There is a difference between effort that stretches capacity and effort that drains it. Living with discipline requires learning to tell the difference. Another part of living with discipline is redefining what commitment looks like. Commitment does not have to mean intensity. It does not have to mean showing up at full capacity every time. It can mean staying connected to the behavior in whatever form is available. On some days, commitment looks like progress. On other days, it looks like maintenance. Both matter. This shift removes a great deal of unnecessary guilt. Guilt thrives on rigid standards. When the standard becomes continuity instead of perfection, guilt loses its leverage. You're no longer constantly measuring yourself against an ideal version of consistency that was never realistic to begin with. Living with discipline also means allowing habits to change shape over time. What fits your life now may not fit it later. Holding on to outdated routines out of pride or obligation turns discipline into rigidity. Rigidity breaks under pressure. Adaptation survives. This flexibility is often misunderstood as weakness. In reality, it is what allows discipline to last. Systems that adapt stay alive. Systems that don't collapse. This is true in biology, and it's true in daily life. Another important aspect is learning to trust quiet consistency. Many people expect discipline to feel dramatic or intense. When it doesn't, they assume it's not working. In reality, effective discipline often feels unremarkable. It blends into daily life. It doesn't demand attention. That quietness is a sign of integration, not failure. Living with discipline also means releasing the need for constant self-evaluation. When every action is judged, pressure increases. Pressure increases stress. Stress reduces capacity. The cycle undermines itself. Discipline thrives in environments where action is allowed to be ordinary. This is why people who are quietly consistent often don't think of themselves as disciplined. They are not constantly monitoring or motivating themselves. Their behaviors are supported enough that discipline is no longer a central concern. It has faded into the background, where it can function without friction. Another key shift is separating discipline from self-worth. When discipline is tied to identity in a moral way, every lapse becomes threatening. When discipline is treated as a practical skill, lapses become data. Data can be used, threat cannot. Living with discipline means being able to say, "This didn't work this week," without turning that observation into a verdict about who you are. It means responding with adjustment rather than punishment. It also means accepting that discipline will look different in different seasons of life. During demanding periods, discipline may mean doing less, not more. During calmer periods, it may mean expanding again. Both are expressions of discipline, not betrayals of it. This perspective allows consistency to survive stress instead of being erased by it. Instead of expecting yourself to perform normally under abnormal conditions, you allow your routines to scale down without disappearing. That scaling down preserves continuity and identity. It keeps the relationship intact. Living with discipline also requires letting go of comparison. Other people's routines, outputs, and capacities are shaped by different constraints. Comparing your consistency to theirs introduces standards that may not fit your life. Discipline built on comparison is brittle. Discipline built on self-knowledge is durable. Another important piece is learning to end the internal negotiation. When discipline is framed as a battle, every action requires persuasion. When discipline is framed as coexistence, action becomes simpler. You do what fits today, and you trust that fitting today matters more than forcing tomorrow. This trust does not come from optimism, it comes from experience. When you see that smaller, sustainable efforts actually lead to more consistency over time, the urge to push too hard fades. The system learns that engagement does not require self-violence. Living with discipline also means allowing rest without guilt. Rest is not the opposite of discipline, it is one of its supports. When rest is treated as failure, recovery is delayed. When recovery is delayed, discipline erodes. Rest that is allowed restores capacity. Rest that is resisted prolongs depletion. Understanding this distinction changes how breaks are experienced. They become part of the process instead of interruptions to it. Another shift is letting discipline serve life, instead of life serving discipline. When routines become more important than well-being, something has gone wrong. Discipline is a tool. Its purpose is to support what matters, not replace it. Living with discipline means checking whether a habit is still serving its role. If it isn't, adjusting or releasing it is not weakness. It is maintenance of the larger system. This also applies to goals. Goals can change. Priorities can shift. Discipline that adapts to new information stays relevant. Discipline that clings to outdated goals becomes burdensome. Living with discipline also involves accepting uncertainty. You don't need to know exactly where consistency will lead. You only need to know that staying engaged at a manageable level keeps options open. Disengagement closes them. Another important realization is that discipline does not require constant clarity. You don't need to feel certain or inspired to continue. You need enough structure to act without debating meaning every time. Meaning can fluctuate. Structure provides continuity. When discipline is lived with, not fought, effort becomes quieter. The internal dialogue softens. The sense of being at war with yourself fades. What remains is a working relationship between intention and capacity. This doesn't mean consistency becomes effortless. It means effort is used where it actually helps. It is spent on setup, adjustment, and recovery, instead of daily coercion. Over time, this makes consistency feel less dramatic, but far more reliable. Living with discipline also changes how success is measured. Success is no longer defined by streaks or intensity. It is defined by durability, by whether the behaviour remains part of life months or years later, even if its form changes. This definition removes the pressure to constantly optimise. Optimization often destabilizes what was already working. Stability matters more than improvement when the goal is long-term consistency. Another subtle benefit of this approach is self-trust. When you stop making promises you can't keep and start designing behaviours you can live with, trust rebuilds naturally. Trust makes engagement easier. Engagement supports consistency. The cycle becomes supportive instead of adversarial. Living with discipline also makes it easier to re-engage after disruption. Because the relationship was not built on punishment or shame, returning does not feel like failure. It feels like continuation. This is perhaps the most important shift of all. Consistency is not about never stopping. It is about not turning stops into endings. Living with discipline keeps the door open. Over time, this approach changes how discipline feels. It stops feeling like a demand and starts feeling like a presence, something that adjusts with you, supports you, and remains available without constant pressure. And that is the quiet truth behind long-term consistency. It is not built through force or moral strength. It is built through understanding, design, and respect for how human systems actually function. When discipline is no longer something you fight, it no longer needs to break you in order to teach you its limits. It simply becomes part of how you move through life, changing shape as needed, present more often than not, and no longer defined by struggle.